Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. I never thought my life would lead me to this. Growing up in a quiet town, I'd always been the type to stick to myself. I wasn't chasing dreams of grandeur or hoping to make a mark on the world. All I wanted was something steady, predictable, and safe. That's how I ended up as a security guard for an office building just outside the city. The job wasn't glamorous, but it suited me. I worked the night shift, patrolling a 4-story building that had been constructed decades ago. It was the kind of place that had seen better days, but wasn't dilapidated. The company that owned it had been renting out office spaces to various businesses, law firms, a tech startup, a marketing agency. During the day, the place buzzed with activity. Phones ringing, people laughing, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. But at night, it was a different story. By 8 p.m., everyone cleared out, leaving me with the creaking of old pipes and the hum of fluorescent lights. My shift started at 9 and ended at 6 in the morning. I'd make rounds every hour, checking each floor, ensuring all the offices were locked, and keeping an eye out for anything unusual. Most nights were uneventful. I'd pass the time scrolling through my phone, reading, or staring out the window at the empty parking lot. I worked alone, though I wasn't the only person who knew the building well. There was the janitor, Greg, who came in during the early evening to mop floors and empty trash bins. Greg was a man of few words. He usually left just as I arrived, giving me a quick nod before disappearing into the night. Then there was Mr. Patel, the building manager. He'd occasionally drop by during the day to check on things or handle tenant complaints. A decent enough guy, but he wasn't someone I interacted with much. For the most part, the building felt like mine during those long hours. It was a silent, empty world where I could think, reflect, and just exist. I knew every corner, every creak of the floorboards, and every flicker of the overhead lights. One detail about the building stuck with me though: the 4th floor. The businesses on the uppermost level had vacated months before I started, and the floor had remained empty since. No tenants, no furniture, just an expanse of dusty, echoing rooms. During my patrols, I'd always feel a slight chill walking through that floor, even though the air conditioning system was the same throughout the building. I told myself it was just my imagination, or the way the empty space amplified the faint sounds of the night. My routine was simple. I'd start on the ground floor, checking the lobby, then work my way up to the 4th. Each floor had a similar layout, long hallways lined with office doors, a break room at the end of the hall, and stairwells at each corner. I carried a flashlight, though the overhead light stayed on all night. Most nights, my patrols were uneventful. The building would groan as it settled, and the occasional car passing by outside would cast brief streaks of light through the windows. But nothing ever happened. That was until the first night I heard it. I was midway through my shift, sitting at the security desk in the lobby, when the sound reached me. Faint at first, almost imperceptible. Footsteps. It's hard to explain what I felt in that moment. My first thought was that it must be Greg. Maybe he'd forgotten something or was finishing up late. But when I checked the time, it was almost midnight. Greg had left hours ago. Still, I brushed it off. It could have been an echo from outside, a pedestrian, or someone in the parking lot. Curiosity got the better of me though, and I decided to do an extra round. I started on the 1st floor, moving quietly, listening for any sounds that might explain what I'd heard. Nothing. The 2nd floor was the same, silent except for the faint buzz of the lights. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I was beginning to question myself. Maybe it was all in my head. Or maybe it was the building itself, an old structure that made noises I wasn't used to noticing. And then, as I ascended the final flight of stairs to the 4th floor, my flashlight flickered. Just for a second. enough to make my heart skip a beat. I paused at the top of the stairs, scanning the dark corridor ahead of me. The lights were dimmer here, as if they were struggling to hold on. The air felt heavier, too, pressing against my skin in a way that made me shiver. But there was no one there. At least, not that I could see. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every creak of the floorboards and every flicker of the lights seemed louder, sharper, more significant. I told myself I was being ridiculous. A grown man, scared by a sound he probably misheard. Still, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as I made my rounds, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. By the time my shift ended, I was relieved to leave the building behind. But as I stepped into the cool morning air and felt the first rays of sunlight on my face, I couldn't help but wonder, had I really heard footsteps, or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? Little did I know, that was only the beginning. The night after I first heard the footsteps, I came into work telling myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me. After all, the building was old, and old buildings have a way of making noises that don't mean anything. I even laughed at myself during the drive to work, shaking off the uneasy feeling that had been sitting with me all day. Still, as I stepped into the lobby, I couldn't help but glance at the stairwell leading to the upper floors. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting their sterile glow on the polished tiles. Everything seemed normal. Just another night. I started my shift the usual way, going through the logs to ensure nothing new had been added. I checked the cameras, noting the empty halls on all 4 floors. It felt reassuring to see them still, lifeless, as they should be. My first patrol was uneventful. The first 3 floors were their usual selves. Silent, almost too quiet, with the faint hum of the building's machinery filling the gaps. And then came the 4th floor. Even before I reached the top of the stairs, I felt a subtle shift in the air, like the atmosphere had thickened ever so slightly. I hesitated at the doorway, my flashlight steady in my hand, and peered down the long corridor. Nothing seemed out of place. I stepped forward, the soles of my boots clicking softly against the tiles, echoing off the empty walls. As I moved down the hall, I noticed something small but strange. One of the doors to an office, a door that I was certain had been closed during my rounds the previous night, was slightly ajar. I stopped in front of it, shining my flashlight into the gap. The room beyond was empty, just as I'd always seen it. The windows let in a sliver of moonlight, casting faint shadows on the floor. Maybe I'd missed it the night before. That had to be it. I stepped inside, pushing the door open fully, and scanned the space. My beam of light moved across the walls, the corners, the empty desks. Nothing. Still, something about the room felt wrong. I backed out and closed the door firmly, testing the handle to make sure it latched. I finished my rounds and headed back down to the lobby. It wasn't until I was sitting at the security desk, scrolling through my phone, that the sound came again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps. This time, I froze. My heart started to race, a dull thudding in my chest as I strained to hear. The footsteps were coming from above, steady and deliberate, as if someone was walking down the hallway. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, unsure of what I was about to encounter. It could have been a late worker who'd forgotten something, I told myself. Maybe Mr. Patel had come in for some reason. But the logical part of my brain knew that didn't make sense. No one ever came into the building at this hour. As I climbed the stairs, the sound stopped abruptly. When I reached the 4th floor, the hallway stretched before me, bathed in dim, flickering light. It was empty, utterly still. I checked every room, pushing open doors and shining my flashlight into every corner. Nothing. And yet, as I stood there in the silence, I felt the weight of eyes on me, as if something unseen was watching. My skin prickled, and a shiver ran down my spine. I completed my patrol and returned to the desk, determined to write the whole thing off as my imagination. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and I found myself glancing at the monitors more often than usual, as if I might catch a glimpse of something. The third night, I decided to test myself. I arrived at work early and made an effort to be extra thorough during my patrols. I checked every lock, every corner, every detail of the building, making mental notes of what I saw. Everything seemed normal. Until midnight. I was sitting at the desk when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were louder, more deliberate, like someone was walking with purpose. They echoed through the building, faint but clear. I stared at the monitors, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The cameras showed nothing unusual. The halls were empty, the doors closed. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the stairs. This time, I moved faster, determined to catch whoever or whatever was making the noise. As I reached the fourth floor, the footsteps stopped again. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I walked down the hallway, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. The door I'd closed the night before, the same one I'd checked and rechecked, was open again. My heart raced as I approached it. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, and my flashlight beam swept across the room. It was empty, just as it had been before. But this time, something caught my eye. In the dust on the floor, there were faint marks. Footprints. They were small, almost childlike, and they stopped abruptly in the middle of the room. I stood there, staring at the prints, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They didn't lead to a door or a window. They just ended. The air in the room felt colder than before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I backed out slowly, closing the door behind me, and made my way downstairs. For the rest of the night, I stayed at the desk, my eyes fixed on the monitors. Every sound, every flicker of the lights set my nerves on edge. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. As I stepped outside into the morning light, I told myself I was done with this. I'd talk to Mr. Patel, maybe even quit. But a part of me knew I wouldn't. Something was happening in that building, and it wasn't finished with me yet. The night after finding those childlike footprints, I walked into the building with my nerves on edge. This wasn't the kind of unease you could just shake off. It clung to me, heavy and suffocating. Even the air in the lobby felt different, colder than usual, with an almost metallic taste to it, like the atmosphere before a storm. I went through my usual routine, logging into the system, checking the cameras, and walking my rounds. The uneventfulness of the first 2 floors felt like a reprieve. On the 3rd floor, though, I started to notice little things, doors that weren't latched properly, chairs slightly moved from their original positions. Small details, but enough to make me pause. When I reached the 4th floor, the hallway stretched out before me in its familiar, eerie silence. I gripped my flashlight tighter and took a deep breath, willing my nerves to calm. The air here felt thick, almost like it was pressing against my skin. Halfway down the corridor, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The door to the same office, the one with the footprints, was not just open this time. It was wide open, as if waiting for me. The hinges groaned softly when I stepped closer, and the sound echoed unnervingly through the empty space. Inside, the room looked just as it had the night before. But there, on the same dusty floor, were fresh footprints. This time, there were more of them. They crisscrossed the room haphazardly, as though someone or something had been pacing back and forth. I knelt down to examine them, my flashlight steady on the floor. The prints were just as small as the last ones, but now they seemed clearer, more defined. I could even make out the faint impression of toes. My breath caught in my throat when I realized something else. Alongside the footprints, there was something else etched faintly into the dust. It looked like lines, almost like scratches. They ran in jagged patterns across the floor, leading toward the center of the room and stopping abruptly, just like the footprints. A sudden, sharp sound broke the silence, a loud thud from somewhere further down the hall. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding, and spun toward the door. The hallway was empty, but the sound had been unmistakable. "Hello?" My voice echoed, shaky and uncertain. No response. I stepped out into the corridor, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. I followed the sound, moving cautiously, every step sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my veins. The thudding noise came again, this time from the far end of the hallway, near the storage room. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle, and I felt a weight of dread settling in my chest. Finally, I pushed it open. The storage room was dimly lit, with rows of shelves stacked with old office equipment. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But as I moved deeper into the room, I noticed something strange. One of the shelves had toppled over, its contents scattered across the floor. It didn't make sense. The shelf was sturdy, bolted to the wall. There was no way it could have fallen on its own. I crouched to examine the mess, my flashlight illuminating the chaos. Amid the scattered papers and binders, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Nestled among the debris was a small, dusty shoe. It was tiny, the kind a child might wear. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. It looked old, almost antique, with fraying laces and a worn sole. I couldn't understand how it had ended up here or why. That night, I spent the rest of my shift at the security desk, my eyes glued to the monitors. I replayed the camera footage over and over, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation for the things I'd seen. But the cameras showed nothing. The hallways were empty, the rooms undisturbed. As the nights went on, the strange events began to escalate. Doors would slam shut without warning, even though there was no draft. The footsteps became more frequent, echoing through the building at odd hours. Lights flickered, plunging entire floors into darkness for minutes at a time. One night, I decided I'd had enough of feeling helpless. I needed answers. I arrived at work earlier than usual, armed with a notebook and a determination to document everything. During my patrols, I took notes on every detail, no matter how small. I marked the position of every chair, every door, every piece of furniture. When the strange events happened again, and they always did, I compared my notes, looking for patterns. That's when I started to notice something chilling. The strange occurrences weren't random. They seemed to be concentrated around the fourth floor, particularly near the office with the footprints. I decided to dig deeper. I began searching through old records, files stored in the dusty cabinets on the third floor. Most of the documents were mundane employee files, maintenance logs, financial reports. But then I stumbled across something that made my pulse quicken. It was an old blueprint of the building, dated decades ago. The layout was mostly the same, but there was one detail that caught my attention. The office where I'd found the footprints, it wasn't originally an office at all. According to the blueprint, that space had once been a storage room, similar to the one at the end of the hallway. Why had it been converted? And why did it seem to be at the center of everything strange that was happening? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. The next night, during my rounds, I lingered in the office longer than usual. I examined the walls, the ceiling, the floor, looking for anything out of place. That's when I noticed a faint outline on one of the walls, almost like a seam. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the rough texture of the paint. It didn't feel like a wall. It felt hollow. I decided to investigate further, but before I could, the building seemed to come alive around me. The lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into darkness. A loud, echoing bang reverberated through the floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, quick, frantic, as if someone was running. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps seemed to be circling me, moving through the walls, the ceiling, the floor. And then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The lights flickered back on, leaving the hallway eerily silent once again. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening in this building, it wasn't just in my head. The fourth floor had become the epicenter of my fears, and that night, it was no different. I couldn't ignore the hollow section of the wall I had found the night before. It was like it was calling to me, daring me to uncover whatever secrets lay behind it. Armed with a flashlight, a screwdriver, and sheer determination, I returned to the office with the strange footprints. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was stifling, heavy with an almost oppressive weight. My flashlight's beam danced across the walls as I approached the scene I discovered. The hollow sound it made when I knocked on it was unmistakable. With trembling hands, I wedged the screwdriver into the seam and began prying at the edges. The paint and plaster cracked away, revealing an old, rusted panel beneath. It was a door, a hidden door, built into the wall. My heart pounded as I gripped the handle. It was cold to the touch, and the resistance it gave felt like it hadn't been opened in decades. With one final pull, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. The smell hit me first, a damp, musty odor, mixed with something metallic. I hesitated, the rational part of my mind screaming at me to stop, to walk away. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pushed me forward. I stepped into the passageway, the walls pressing in on either side. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness, illuminating a staircase leading down. The further I descended, the colder it became, the air thick with an unnatural chill. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with old shelves, cluttered with dusty jars and faded photographs. In the center of the room stood a small wooden table, its surface scarred with deep grooves and stains. But it was what lay on the floor that made my blood run cold. There, etched into the concrete, was a large, circular pattern. Symbols I didn't recognize formed an intricate design, their lines sharp and precise. The dust that covered the rest of the room seemed to avoid the circle entirely, as if it were untouched by time. I stepped closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I examined the symbols, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper, soft and chilling, echoing from somewhere within the room. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a single voice, but a chorus, overlapping and distorted, as if dozens of people were speaking at once. My flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment before the beam steadied again. That's when I saw a shadow, just at the edge of the circle. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, boring into me. "Get out!" The voices hissed in unison, the sound reverberating through the room. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the circle. The moment my shoe crossed the line, the room erupted in chaos. The lights in my flashlight burst, plunging me into complete darkness. The air grew colder, biting at my skin. The whispers turned to screams, deafening and relentless, filling every corner of the space. I felt a pressure against my chest, as if an invisible force were pushing me back. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I scrambled to the stairs, my hands clawing at the walls for support. Just as I reached the top, the door to the passageway slammed shut behind me with a thunderous bang. The sound echoed through the hallway, followed by an eerie silence. I leaned against the wall, my body trembling, trying to catch my breath. But the silence didn't last long. The footsteps began again, this time louder and more deliberate. They weren't just in the hallway, they were everywhere, surrounding me. I turned toward the exit, my only thought to escape, but the door at the end of the hall was no longer there. In its place was a solid wall, smooth and unbroken. Panic set in as I frantically searched for another way out. The footsteps grew closer, their cadence uneven, as if whatever was making them was limping. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, the fluorescent lights above flickering erratically. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, darting in and out of the dim light. Then I saw it, the figure from the basement. It stood at the far end of the hallway, its silhouette barely visible against the flickering light. It began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its elongated limbs swaying unnaturally with each step. No, no, I muttered, backing away. The figure stopped abruptly, its head tilting to the side as if studying me. And then, without warning, it lunged. The force hit me like a truck, sending me sprawling to the ground. My flashlight skittered across the floor, its beam flickering wildly. I scrambled to my feet, but the figure was gone, the hallway empty once again. I bolted toward the stairwell, not caring where it led, as long as it was away from that thing. When I reached the stairs, I didn't stop. I sprinted down, my footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself in the lobby. The familiar sight should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The lobby was different, darker, colder, and completely devoid of sound. I turned toward the front doors, my heart leaping at the thought of escape. But just as I reached for the handle, the glass shattered inward, a deafening crash that sent shards flying. The figure stood on the other side, its twisted form illuminated by the dim light from outside. "Leave," it hissed, its voice low and guttural. Without thinking, I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a splash of water. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. When I finally looked back at the building, the figure was gone. But the oppressive feeling remained, a weight pressing down on me even in the open air. The encounter left me shaken, my mind racing with questions. What had I seen? What was behind that hidden door? And why did it seem like the building itself was alive, working against me? The answers wouldn't come easily, but one thing was clear: I could never step foot in that building again. When I finally stumbled out into the cool night air, the reality of what had happened inside that building began to sink in. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the pavement, my back resting against the cold concrete of the parking lot curb. Every breath felt like a laborious task, as though my lungs were still trapped in the oppressive weight of the fourth floor. The streetlights outside buzzed faintly, their pale glow doing little to dispel the shadows that seemed to cling to me like an unwelcome shroud. I was out of the building, but I wasn't free. My mind raced, replaying every sound, every shadow, and every fleeting glimpse of that grotesque figure. The first thing I did was call my supervisor. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number, and when he picked up, I blurted out everything, well, almost everything. I avoided mentioning the figure or the whispers, fearing he would think I'd lost my mind. Instead, I focused on the physical aspects: the hidden passageway, the strange symbols, and the inexplicable sensations. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss me outright. Instead, there was a long pause before he said, "You're not the first to mention something weird in that building. Let's get you out of there for a while. I'll find a replacement for the night shift until we can figure this out." It was a small relief, but it didn't erase the lingering dread. The next few days passed in a blur. I avoided going near the building, even during the daytime. My supervisor asked me to file a report, but how could I? How could I put into words the things I'd seen and heard? Every time I tried, my hands froze over the keyboard, my mind replaying that unearthly chorus of voices and the figure's twisted silhouette. I started having nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that narrow hallway, the footsteps growing louder, the walls pressing in. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers still ringing in my ears. In an attempt to find some semblance of closure, I began researching the building. I pored over old newspaper archives, city records, and anything I could get my hands on. The building's history was murky at best, but I did find a few disturbing details. Decades ago, the site had housed a psychiatric facility, one with a reputation for questionable practices. Patients had reportedly gone missing, and there were whispers of inhumane experiments. The facility had been shut down, its records sealed, and the building eventually repurposed into the office complex it was today. But the most chilling discovery came from an old, yellowed article buried deep in the archives. It mentioned a series of unexplained deaths among the facility's staff, all occurring in the same room, the very room I had found hidden behind the wall. I couldn't ignore the connection. The symbols etched into the floor, the oppressive atmosphere, the figure it all pointed to something dark and unnatural tied to that space. But what could I do about it? One evening, after another sleepless night, I decided to share my experiences with a close friend, someone I trusted completely. I hesitated, fearing their judgment, but to my surprise, they listened intently. "You need to tell someone," they said firmly. "Someone who can actually investigate this. If it's real, it's dangerous not just for you, but for anyone who steps into that building." Their words stuck with me, and the next day, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was indulging in a bad horror movie trope, but I didn't know where else to turn. The investigator, a serious and methodical man with years of experience, agreed to meet me. When I described what I had seen and heard, his expression didn't waver. Instead, he asked for details, precise descriptions of the symbols, the layout of the room, and the events leading up to my discovery. After a long pause, he said, "This isn't the first time I've heard of something like this, but it's rare to find something so active in a modern building. I'll need to investigate the site myself." Against my better judgment, I agreed to accompany him back to the building. We chose a Sunday afternoon when the place would be empty. As we entered, the atmosphere felt different, less oppressive, but still unsettling. We made our way to the fourth floor, the investigator taking detailed notes and snapping photos of the hallway, the footprints, and finally, the hidden door. When he stepped into the basement room, he froze, his flashlight illuminating the circle on the floor. "These symbols," he muttered, crouching down to examine them. "They're not just random markings. This is a containment circle designed to hold something inside, but it's been broken." His words sent a chill down my spine. "Broken? What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means whatever was being contained here is no longer bound. And judging by your experiences, it's still lingering in this building." He began setting up equipment, motion sensors, audio recorders, and a device he referred to as an EMF detector. I watched uneasily as he worked, my nerves on edge. As the hours passed, the building remained eerily quiet. But just as we were about to pack up, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air became thick, and the faint sound of whispers began to echo once more. The investigator's equipment lit up, the EMF detector spiking wildly. "It's here," he said, his voice steady but tense. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. My heart raced as the whispers grew louder, surrounding us from all sides. "Stay calm," the investigator said, though I could hear the strain in his voice. "We need to leave. Now." We stumbled back up the stairs, the oppressive presence following us every step of the way. When we reached the lobby, the front doors were wide open, as if inviting us to leave. We didn't hesitate. Once outside, the investigator turned to me, his face pale. "I've dealt with a lot of strange things in my career, but this is something else. Whatever's in that building, it's tied to that room and those symbols. Without professional help, it's not going anywhere." The experience left me shaking, but for the first time, I felt a sense of validation. I wasn't losing my mind. Something real and dangerous was in that building. I reported everything to my supervisor, who decided to escalate the issue to the building's owners. In the days that followed, the fourth floor was sealed off, and the office tenants were relocated. The investigator offered to help bring in specialists to cleanse the space, but I didn't stick around to see how it played out. I resigned from my position as a security guard shortly after. The memories of that building were too much to bear, and I knew I couldn't go back. Even now, the experience haunts me. I often wonder if the specialists were successful or if the building's secrets remain buried. What I do know is this: some places are better left alone. Months have passed since I last set foot in that building, and yet the events of those nights linger with me like shadows that refuse to dissipate. Life has moved on, but a part of me remains tethered to the memory of what transpired. I've replayed it all in my mind countless times, wondering if there was something I missed, some sign, some detail that could make sense of it all. But sense, I've come to realize, isn't something that applies here. What happened in that building defies logic, explanation, and the comforting boundaries of the world we think we understand. I left the security job shortly after the ordeal. It wasn't just the fear, it was the weight of knowing that I could never walk those halls again without feeling that suffocating presence. A part of me worried that leaving the job would mean leaving behind any chance of closure, but staying wasn't an option. I found work elsewhere, in a setting far removed from quiet, empty buildings. It helped, to some extent, to be surrounded by people and noise, but the silence of the night still unnerves me. Even now, I avoid quiet places, afraid of what I might hear if I listen too closely. The paranormal investigator reached out to me a few weeks after our escape. He said the building's owners had brought in a team of specialists to cleanse the space, but he didn't know how successful they had been. The energy there is old and deeply rooted, he said. Sometimes you can't banish something like that. You can only contain it. His words did little to comfort me. The thought of that presence still lingering in the building, or worse, finding a way to spread, keeps me awake some nights. Out of morbid curiosity, I searched for updates about the building. The office complex has remained operational, though the fourth floor has been permanently closed off. Officially, it's listed as a maintenance issue, but I know better. I can't help but wonder if the people working there ever feel it, the faint chill, the heavy silence, the whispers on the edge of hearing. I considered going back once, just to see if I could face it again. But the thought of stepping into that building, of hearing those footsteps, or seeing that figure again, was enough to make me abandon the idea. In the months since, I've tried to make peace with what happened. I've told the story to a few close friends, their reactions ranging from disbelief to unease. Some tried to rationalize it, suggesting stress, exhaustion, or even hallucinations. Others, like the investigator, believed me entirely. But belief doesn't bring closure. It doesn't erase the fear or answer the questions that still haunt me. The most unsettling part isn't the memories of what I saw, it's the feeling that it's not truly over. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced I've heard those whispers again. I'll check my apartment, turning on every light, but nothing is ever there. Other times, I'll catch myself avoiding mirrors, afraid of what I might see reflected behind me. It's irrational, I know, but the fear has become a part of me, a constant undercurrent in my life. I've come to accept that some questions will never have answers. What was that figure? What happened in that room? And why me? I'll never know. Perhaps it's better that way. The investigator once told me that certain places are like wounds in the fabric of reality, places where the boundaries between worlds become thin. Maybe that building is one of those places, a wound that refuses to heal. In the end, I'm left with a choice, to let the fear consume me or to move forward, carrying the experience as a scar, but not a weight. Some days, it's easier said than done. When I look back on it all, I feel a strange mix of emotions. There's fear, of course, but also a sense of awe. Whatever it was that I encountered, it was beyond anything I ever thought possible. It's a reminder that the world is vast and mysterious, full of things we may never understand. As I sit here, writing this, I find myself wondering if sharing the story is enough to lift the burden. Maybe, in putting it into words, I can finally lay it to rest. Or maybe, as the investigator warned me, some things are better left unsaid. For now, all I can do is move forward, one day at a time, and hope that the whispers stay behind me. I work late shifts at an office downtown, a place I had come to know as my second home. The building itself was nothing special, a rectangular block of brick and glass, tucked between a parking garage and an unremarkable coffee shop. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see in a movie, but it had its charm in a worn-out, functional way. The office had an open floor plan, dotted with rows of cubicles and a few private meeting rooms lining the walls. It always smelled faintly of printer ink and stale coffee, a scent that seemed to cling to my clothes long after I left. I had been working there for a little over 3 years, mostly handling logistics for a small but growing tech firm. It was a good job, steady, predictable, and quiet. Quiet being the operative word, especially during those late hours when most of the staff had already gone home. That's when I felt most productive. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the gentle tap of my keyboard, it was almost soothing. Some nights, I'd bring a late dinner and eat at my desk, scrolling through emails while the city outside the windows grew still. The only sounds I could hear came from the occasional car passing by or the muffled clang of the elevator doors opening in the lobby below. At the time, I didn't think much about how empty the building felt after dark. It was just part of the job. Most of my coworkers preferred the regular 9 to 5 grind, but I had always been a bit of a night owl. Plus, the solitude let me focus on my work without interruptions. I should mention that I wasn't completely alone. The cleaning crew usually arrived around midnight, wheeling their carts of supplies and vacuuming their way from floor to floor. I rarely saw them, though. They tended to stick to the other side of the building, near the main conference rooms. If anything, their occasional presence was reassuring, a small reminder that I wasn't the only person awake in that vast, dimly lit space. There's something oddly comforting about routine, isn't there? The predictability of it. I'd clock in, settle at my desk, and lose myself in spreadsheets and project updates. My boss, a detail-oriented man with a penchant for late-night emails, often left me notes to follow up on in the morning. "You're a night shift guy," he'd say, laughing. "The office ghost." It was a joke, of course, and one I found amusing at the time. But that was before things started to change. Before the nights became different. My name's Eric, by the way. I've never been one to put much stock in ghost stories or superstitions. I grew up in a small town where the biggest scare came from local kids trying to spook each other with tales of haunted barns or witches in the woods. I guess you could say I had a pretty grounded outlook on life. But looking back now, I can't explain everything that happened in that office, at least, not in a way that makes sense. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow creeping along the edges of your vision. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. You know how your mind plays tricks on you when you're tired? Creak here, a flicker there, it's easy to dismiss. I wasn't the only one who worked late occasionally, but the others usually stuck to the upper floors. They'd pop in briefly, grab some files or check on a project, and then head out, leaving me alone again. If anything, I preferred it that way. The fewer distractions, the better. Still, there were moments when I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't anything overt, just a vague sense of unease that would come and go like a breeze through an open window. I'd glance up from my screen, half expecting to see someone standing nearby, only to find empty cubicles stretching out before me. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. What would I even say? "Hey, I feel weird sometimes when I'm working late." It sounded ridiculous. Besides, I figured it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, humans are social creatures, and spending hours in a near-empty building isn't exactly normal. But the strangeness didn't stop there. If anything, it began to build, piece by piece, like a puzzle I didn't even know I was solving. I remember one night in particular, a Tuesday, I think, when I stayed later than usual to finish a project. By the time I looked at the clock, it was past 1 a.m. The cleaning crew had already left, and the silence in the office felt heavier than usual, pressing against my ears like cotton. I stretched, rubbing my eyes, and stood up to grab a coffee from the break room. The walk through the rows of cubicles was uneventful, but as I reached the doorway, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. The sound was faint, barely audible, but it stopped me in my tracks. I stood at the threshold of the break room, gripping the doorframe, my ears straining to catch it again. It wasn't the mechanical hum of the air conditioning or the distant traffic outside. No, it was something else entirely, low, indistinct, almost like someone speaking. For a moment, I wondered if one of my coworkers had come back to retrieve something. But who would be here this late? The cleaning crew had already finished their rounds, and I hadn't heard the elevator ding. The thought was fleeting, dismissed as quickly as it arrived. It had to be my imagination. I shook it off and stepped into the break room. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I poured myself a cup of coffee. The warmth of the mug was grounding, a small comfort against the unease creeping into my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling or a random gust of wind sneaking through a vent. Buildings have their own way of breathing, don't they? But as I stood there sipping my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, the silence too pronounced, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I decided to go back to my desk and focus on my work. Distractions like this happen when you were overtired and I had deadlines to meet. But as I walked back through the maze of cubicles, I heard it again, this time clearer, more distinct. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice. My heart quickened as I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. The sound seemed to be coming from one of the meeting rooms on the far end of the floor. It was muffled, as though someone was speaking behind a closed door, but I couldn't make out any words. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. Maybe someone had stayed late and was on a call or going over notes. That had to be it. There was no other logical explanation. But the voice didn't sound conversational. It wasn't the steady cadence of someone explaining or presenting something. It was softer, almost pleading. I debated whether to check it out. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to go back to my desk and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But another part, the part that wouldn't let me sleep if I left it unresolved, urged me to investigate. I walked cautiously toward the source of the sound, my footsteps barely making a noise on the thin carpet. As I approached the meeting room, the voice grew quieter, fading into a faint hum. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. There was no response. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was empty. I stepped inside, scanning the space. The table and chairs were undisturbed, the whiteboard blank, the lights off except for the faint glow spilling in from the hallway. I checked the corners, even under the table, feeling ridiculous as I did so. There was nothing there. But the air in the room felt different, colder, somehow. Not like the chill of air conditioning, but something deeper, more penetrating. I rubbed my arms and stepped back into the hallway, shutting the door behind me. As I walked back to my desk, I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was an auditory illusion, the way sound travels through empty spaces. Or maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. Either way, I convinced myself it wasn't worth dwelling on. For the rest of the night, I kept my head down, working diligently to finish my tasks. But the memory of that voice lingered, a nagging thought at the back of my mind. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. When I finally clocked out and made my way to the elevator, the building felt different. The familiar hum of the lights, the distant murmur of the city, it all seemed muted, as though the world had shifted ever so slightly. I told myself I was imagining things, that everything would feel normal again in the morning. But as the elevator doors closed, sealing me off from the empty floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I debated telling someone about what had happened. A coworker, perhaps, or even my boss. But what would I say? "Hey, I think I heard a ghost last night." It sounded absurd, even to me. So I kept it to myself. But that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. The following nights were worse. Much worse. It started with small things barely noticeable, but undeniably there. I'd sit at my desk, headphones on, typing away, and catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, like a shadow darting past the cubicle walls, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just my peripheral vision playing tricks on me, a natural side effect of staring at a screen for hours. But then there were the sounds. They were subtle at first, soft creaks and groans that could be attributed to the building's infrastructure. But soon they grew louder, more distinct. A chair scraping against the floor, the sharp click of a pen being dropped, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps on the carpet. Every time I heard something, I'd look up, scanning the rows of cubicles and empty spaces around me. Nothing. The office was as still as ever, the dim lighting casting long shadows that only deepened my unease. One night, I decided to test it. I stood up from my desk and walked toward the sound of the footsteps, my heart pounding with every step. The sound seemed to come from the far end of the floor, near the storage closet. As I approached, the footsteps stopped. I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door of the closet. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the silence was oppressive. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before turning it. The closet was empty. I let out a shaky breath, more annoyed than scared at this point. Was someone messing with me? A coworker pulling some elaborate prank? The thought crossed my mind, but it didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be here this late, and I hadn't seen anyone come or go. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next night, I arrived at the office with a sense of dread I couldn't quite explain. The routine of setting up my workspace and diving into tasks was no longer comforting. Every sound, every flicker of light put me on edge. Around midnight, it happened again. I was working on a particularly tedious report when I heard a faint tap, tap, tap behind me. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it sent a chill down my spine. I spun around in my chair, my eyes scanning the open floor. The sound stopped. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No response. I stood up, clutching the edge of my desk for support, and took a tentative step forward. That's when I saw it. A faint shadow moved across the frosted glass of one of the meeting rooms. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't alone. Summoning every ounce of courage, I walked toward the meeting room, my footsteps eerily loud in the silence. The shadow didn't move again, but the closer I got, the more oppressive the air became. I reached the door and peered inside. The room was empty. Empty, except for a single chair that had been pulled away from the table and was now facing the doorway, as if waiting for me. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. The next day, I decided to investigate. I went through the office security logs, checking for any unusual activity or unauthorized access. Nothing. The cameras showed me arriving, working, and leaving. No one else. But I knew what I'd seen. I started talking to the cleaning staff, casually asking if they'd noticed anything strange during their shifts. Most of them shrugged it off, saying they were too busy to pay attention. But one older janitor paused, his expression shifting. "You work late nights, huh?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. He hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "This building's got history," he said. "Don't stay too late, all right?" Before I could press him for details, he walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. The following night, I arrived at the office, determined to get to the bottom of this. I brought a small recorder with me, placing it on my desk to capture any sounds or voices I might miss. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the air grew. The usual creaks and groans of the building were now accompanied by faint whispers so faint I couldn't make out the words. I checked the recorder periodically, but it only seemed to pick up static. Frustrated, I returned to my work, trying to block out the noise. But then, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from all around me, enveloping me in a cacophony of indistinct voices. I stood up, spinning in circles, trying to locate the source. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. I grabbed the recorder and played it back. At first, there was nothing but static. But as I listened closer, I heard something faint but unmistakable. "Voice! Leave!" The word was clear, sharp, and sent a jolt of fear through my body. I turned off the recorder and stared at it, my mind racing. This was no longer just a series of strange occurrences. This was real, and it was escalating. Determined not to be driven out, I decided to stay and confront whatever or whoever was causing this. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I began a methodical sweep of the office, checking every room, every corner, every shadow. The building was silent, eerily so. Even the usual hum of the lights seemed muted. As I moved through the space, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I reached the far end of the floor, where the storage closet was located. The door was ajar, just slightly, as if inviting me in. I approached cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, the closet was empty, at least, at first glance. But then, I noticed something etched into the wall, faint but visible in the beam of my flashlight. It was a single word: "Leave." The letters were jagged, as if scratched in a fit of desperation. I backed out of the closet, my heart pounding. This wasn't just strange anymore. This was a warning. But leaving wasn't an option, not yet. I had to know what was happening, why it was happening. As I returned to my desk, the air felt heavier than ever, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. And then, the lights flickered. One by one, the overhead fluorescents began to shut off, plunging the office into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam shaky as I swept it across the room. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, revealing an office that looked exactly as it always had, except for one detail. On my desk, in the middle of my neatly stacked papers, was a single old photograph. It showed the office, or at least a version of it. The furniture was different, the decor outdated, but it was unmistakably the same space. And in the center of the photo, standing where my desk now was a man. His face was obscured, blurred as if in motion, but his posture was unmistakable. He was staring directly at the camera. The photograph on my desk stared back at me, its faded edges and grainy detail sending a shiver down my spine. For a long moment, I couldn't move, my eyes glued to the image as if it held the answers to everything that had been happening. It was as if the man in the photograph was waiting for me to make the next move, waiting to reveal the truth. I reached for the photo, my hands shaking, but the moment my fingers brushed the edges, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath became visible in a sudden chill, and the light overhead flickered. I dropped the photo instinctively, my heart racing in my chest. Something wasn't right. Something was here. It wasn't just a presence I could sense. It was an overwhelming force, suffocating and cold. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, every nerve screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. I had to know what this was. I reached for my phone and opened the security footage app, desperate to see something, anything that would explain this. I scrolled through the recordings of the past few nights. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just me working, the occasional flicker of the lights, and then it happened. As I played back the footage from earlier that night, I froze. The timestamp on the screen showed me sitting at my desk, typing as usual, when suddenly, a figure emerged in the corner of the frame. The shadowy form was too indistinct to make out clearly, but it was unmistakably there, creeping along the edge of the cubicle. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were aware that I was watching. My pulse quickened. I rewound the footage, playing it again. The figure was closer now. Its movement was unnerving, too smooth, too fluid for a person. It seemed to glide, almost floating across the floor. And then, the moment I had dreaded its face came into view. It was the man from the photograph. I gasped, stumbling backward. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears as the cold in the room deepened, and the lights flickered again, this time more violently, as if protest what I was seeing. The man's face was a blur in the footage, but I could make out his features pale, gaunt, and strangely distorted. His eyes were black holes, empty and consuming, staring directly into the camera. I watched in horror as the figure reached the door of the office. For a split second, it turned its head, looking directly at the camera. Then it stepped out of frame, and everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that it was real. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled back, my body frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. It was impossible to ignore the fact that the figure I had seen in the footage was the same as the one in the photograph. He was here, in this office, and had been for who knows how long. Then, everything changed. The air grew heavier, and the temperature dropped again. I could see my breath fogging in the air as a low, guttural sound filled the room. It started as a soft hum, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The walls creaked in protest, and the overhead lights flickered violently before going completely dark. I fumbled for the flashlight on my desk, my hands slick with sweat. My heart was racing, and I could feel the panic setting in. This wasn't just some prank or figment of my imagination. This was real. The hum turned into a low growl, vibrating through my bones, sending a wave of dread crashing over me. I turned on the flashlight, but the beam of light barely pierced the darkness. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was just beyond my vision, watching me. That's when I heard it. A voice! It was faint at first, a whisper that seemed to come from every direction, echoing in my mind as much as in the room. It wasn't the soft, insistent whisper from before. This was different. This was clear, distinct, and filled with a malice that sent chills crawling down my spine. Leave. Now. The voice was deep, guttural, and full of something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. I froze, unable to move, my eyes darting around the room, searching for the source. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my hand, cutting through the darkness like a knife, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. Leave, or I will take you. I couldn't tell if the voice was coming from the walls or inside my own head, but it didn't matter. It was there, and it was real. My mind was spinning, my thoughts racing as panic gripped me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The terror was consuming me, flooding my body with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, the temperature dropped again. I could see my breath in the air, and I shivered uncontrollably. The air was thick now, as if it were pressing against me, suffocating me. I staggered back, unable to tear my eyes away from the spot where the man's figure had stood in the photograph, feeling like he was still there, standing just out of view. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like they were echoing in my head. The sound of each footstep grew louder, closer, until I felt a presence behind me. The cold intensified, biting at my skin, and I dared not turn around. I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone anymore. He was here. I spun around in a panic, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and my heart stopped. There he was. The man from the photograph, standing in front of me, his pale face distorted and twisted in a way that no human could ever look. His eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light around him. He didn't move, didn't speak, but he was there. His presence was suffocating, his figure looming over me like he was about to reach out, and I screamed. The scream was raw, primal, and filled with a terror I had never known. It echoed in the room, the sound bouncing off the walls and filling every corner of the office. My breath was ragged, my body trembling with the sheer force of the fear I felt. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the room went completely silent. The lights flickered back on, the temperature returned to normal, and the man was gone. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving with the aftermath of the encounter. I could barely breathe, my mind reeling from what had just happened, what I had just seen. The office was silent once again, but it felt wrong. Empty, yet filled with an unseen presence. Something was still there, lurking just beyond my vision, watching me. I couldn't stay. I had to leave. But the moment I reached for my things, the door to the office slammed shut, trapping me inside. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged within me, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. But no one could hear me. No one would come. I was alone. And then the whispers began again. This time, they weren't faint. They were clear. They were coming from all around me, and I could hear them now, echoing in my mind as much as in the room. Stay. Stay with us. I couldn't understand. I couldn't comprehend what was happening, but one thing was clear, there was no escaping now. I didn't know how long I sat there in the dim light of the office, pressing my back against the wall, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. Every inch of me screamed to get out to run, to escape from whatever presence was holding me in place. My eyes kept darting around the room, expecting to see him again, the man from the photograph, standing silently in the corner or emerging from the shadows. I could still feel the heavy weight of his gaze, even though he was gone. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. The air in the office was thick, suffocating, and every movement seemed to amplify the silence that pressed down on me. I knew I had to leave, but the door still wouldn't open. Panic clawed at my chest, and I rushed back to the door, twisting the handle desperately, pushing with all my strength, but it wouldn't give. I pounded on it with both fists, shouting for help, but I knew it was pointless. No one was coming. No one had heard my screams earlier. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in, and with every passing second, my hope of escape grew slimmer. Then, a soft sound, something I almost didn't hear, but it stopped me dead in my tracks. A faint scratching noise, as if something was moving just beyond the door. A faint shuffle that made my skin crawl. My heart raced, and I instinctively backed away, my eyes wide with terror. I knew what it was. It was him. But it wasn't the man from the photograph. This was something different, something far worse. There was no face to see, no distinct form to recognize, just a shifting presence, an inhuman force moving silently through the darkness. The scratching continued, getting louder with each passing second. It was coming closer. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. The room wasn't empty. It had never been empty. I wasn't dealing with one spirit, one haunting entity. I was trapped in a space filled with something much more terrifying, a collection of malevolent forces, bound together by something dark and ancient. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, and I staggered backward, my mind racing, trying to grasp at anything that made sense. The shadows around me seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching for me, pulling at my soul. I had to escape. I had to find a way out. I turned back to the desk, grabbing my phone with shaking hands. It was my only connection to the outside world, my only hope of reaching anyone who could help. The phone screen flickered to life, the brightness almost blinding in the darkness. I quickly dialed the number for the building security, praying for someone to answer. The line clicked, and for a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end. Hello? The voice on the other end sounded muffled, distant, as if coming from a long way away. Please help. I'm trapped, I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The door won't open. There's something here, something in this office. You have to. Suddenly, the line went dead. The call was disconnected, and the silence returned, thicker than before. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the phone, feeling the weight of the situation crush down on me. There was no escape. No help would come. Whatever had taken hold of this place had no intention of letting me go. I dropped the phone in desperation, hearing the soft clink as it hit the floor. My pulse was racing, my breaths coming in shallow, rapid gasps. I turned to the window, but it was no use. The blinds were drawn tight, blocking out any trace of light from the outside world. I had no idea what time it was, how long I had been in here. Hours? Days? It all felt the same now, an endless nightmare. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and my gaze flickered to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to coalesce, taking on a shape that made my stomach churn. The air turned cold again, and I could feel the presence closing in. Whatever it was coming for me. I knew that I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to break free, no matter the cost. My heart hammered in my chest as I charged toward the door again, trying the handle one last time. And this time, it gave. The door creaked open with a groan, and the flood of cold air rushed past me. The hallway beyond was dark, the lights flickering as if they too were hesitant to fully illuminate the path. I hesitated only for a moment before I sprinted into the corridor, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the building. But I didn't dare stop. I couldn't afford to stop. I didn't know if whatever had been haunting me was behind me or still trapped inside that office, but I had no intention of finding out. I ran down the hallway, heart racing, breath coming in ragged gasps. The familiar layout of the building was a blur as I passed by empty desks and darkened conference rooms. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I reached the stairwell, I hesitated for only a moment, feeling the pull of the darkness behind me. But something urged me on, pushing me toward the exit, toward the only thing that might offer me safety. I sprinted down the stairs, my feet pounding against the concrete, until I reached the lobby. The door to the outside world was right there, beckoning me with the promise of freedom. But when I grabbed the handle, I froze. The door was locked. My mind raced. I yanked at the handle again, pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The outside world was just beyond the glass, and yet I was trapped inside, just as I had been in that office. I could feel the darkness gathering around me again, pressing in from all sides, and for the first time I understood. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The figurine. The man from the photograph, standing at the far end of the lobby, his black eyes fixed on me. He didn't move, but I felt his presence as though it were a physical force, pushing against me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to move as he slowly began to approach. Each step he took was like the sound of thunder, shaking the very ground beneath me. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. And then there was nothing. No footsteps, no presence, no darkness. I opened my eyes, blinking rapidly as I looked around. The man was gone. The building was silent again, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. I stood there in shock, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I reached for the door handle one last time. This time, it opened. I stumbled outside into the night, gasping for air, my heart still pounding in my chest. The cool breeze hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I was free. But as I turned and looked back at the building, I saw something in the window of the top floor, a shadow moving behind the glass. I couldn't be sure, but I knew. Whatever it was still there, waiting. And I wasn't sure I'd escaped at all. I left the city the next day, my belongings packed into my car, and I didn't look back. I couldn't. The terror I had experienced in that office haunted me, lingering in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of what I had seen, what I had survived. But the truth was, no matter where I went, I couldn't outrun it. The man from the photograph, the whispers, the cold, they were a part of me now. They followed me, invisible and silent, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I didn't have the answers. I didn't know why it had happened or what I had encountered. All I knew was that something evil had taken hold of that office, something that didn't belong in this world, and it wasn't finished with me yet. The nightmare was far from over. I thought about leaving the city, moving to another place, changing my life entirely. Maybe it was a temporary escape, a way to find some peace after everything that happened, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The events that had unfolded in that office weren't just a series of isolated incidents. They were something far more pervasive, something that couldn't simply be outrun. Weeks passed, and I tried to get on with my life. I found a new job in a small town, far away from the city and the building where everything had gone wrong. It was quiet. The days felt peaceful, the air light and free from the heavy weight of fear that had once burdened me. My new coworkers were kind, and I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I was starting to move on from what I had experienced. But the whispers began again. At first, it was faint, almost like a breeze through the trees on a still afternoon. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just being paranoid. After all, who wouldn't be after going through what I had? But then, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They weren't in the wind anymore, they were inside my head. It wasn't just the darkness I was trying to outrun, it was following me, tethering itself to my very thoughts. I tried to dismiss it, convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I wasn't going to let it control me. But no matter where I went, I felt it. That presence. It was subtle at first, a feeling of someone watching me. I'd look over my shoulder in a crowded street and see nothing. But the unease remained, like a shadow clinging to me, never far behind. One evening, I sat alone in my apartment, the room bathed in the warm glow of the desk lamp. My fingers hovered over my keyboard, trying to work, trying to distract myself from the gnawing sense that something was wrong. That's when I saw it a flicker at the corner of my eye, a subtle movement in the shadows. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was nothing, just the light playing tricks on me, just the remnants of an overactive imagination. But when I turned my head to look directly, there he was, the man from the photograph. His figure was solid in the dim light, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, just watching me. His eyes were as black as coal, unblinking, unfeeling. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. I couldn't tear my gaze away from his hollow, emotionless stare. I could feel the air in the room shift, grow heavier, colder. The whispers were back now, louder than ever, filling the silence with voices I didn't recognize, voices I didn't want to hear. For the first time since I left the city, I felt the full weight of what had happened in that office. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a curse, something that had latched onto me and refused to let go. I didn't know how or why it had found me again, but it was clear that I couldn't escape it. There was no running from this, no safe haven to hide in. The presence in the office, the figure, the whispers, they were part of me now, a dark part that I couldn't sever. I took a deep breath, the chill of fear crawling up my spine. For a moment, I considered going to the authorities, telling someone what had happened, explaining that I wasn't just another crazy person seeing things. But who would believe me? Who could understand something so deeply unnatural? The man took a slow step forward, his footfall soundless against the wooden floor. I backed away, my heart thundering in my chest, but I couldn't look away. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence alone carried an unnerving weight, an undeniable truth that I couldn't escape. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel his presence shift, the air around me growing colder, the whispers in my mind louder. The office, the darkness, the eerie silence, it was all coming back, enveloping me. There was no getting away. The curse I had thought I'd escaped was simply waiting, patiently, to return. I shook my head, trying to pull myself together, trying to gather enough strength to confront whatever this was. But as I stood there in my apartment, the reality began to sink in. It wasn't just a series of events. It was never just an isolated incident. This wasn't something that could be explained or rationalized. It was something old, something dark, something that had been watching me long before that fateful night in the office. A realization washed over me, then a chilling, sobering thought that hit me like a wave. I wasn't supposed to escape. There was no escape. The thing in the office had found me, yes, but it was never after me. It was after something deeper, something I had never understood. The connection was not merely physical, it was spiritual, a tethering of souls that couldn't be undone. The figure in the doorway began to fade, melting into the shadows once more. But the whispers remained, growing louder, rushing through my ears. I pressed my hands to my head, trying to block them out, trying to make them stop. But they wouldn't. They never would. I wasn't sure how long I sat there in the dark, alone with my thoughts, but the realization began to sink in fully. I had thought leaving the city, leaving that office, would free me. I had thought that running away would erase the fear, the memory, the haunting. But that wasn't how it worked. I had never been free of it. Not really. There was no end to this story. No final chapter. Just an endless loop of terror that would follow me wherever I went. I would never be able to outrun it. And as the shadows closed in again, as the whispers filled my mind and the figure remained somewhere in the dark, I knew with a certainty I could no longer deny. It was just another night on the road for me, a long-haul truck driver, doing what I'd done for years. My truck was my home, and the highway was where I spent most of my waking hours. The hum of the engine, the steady flow of traffic, and the occasional flicker of streetlights passing by these things had become second nature. I didn't mind the solitude. Most people thought I was crazy for choosing a life behind the wheel, but it worked for me. Being away from home, on the road for days, sometimes weeks, meant I had time to think, to clear my mind, and to escape the noise of everyday life. It was the kind of life where routine was king. I'd pick up a load, drive it to its destination, take a short rest, and then repeat the process. Simple, predictable. The same roads, the same rest stops, and the same truckers I saw along the way. We'd wave to each other, maybe share a meal at a diner, and continue on our separate paths. Some drivers became regular faces at certain truck stops, and there was comfort in that familiarity, even if we didn't know each other by name. I'd been on this particular route for a few months. It was a long stretch of road that ran from New York down to Florida, a route that took me through small towns, sprawling cities, and desolate stretches of highway. The kind of route where time seemed to stretch on forever, and the only company I had was the road and the occasional radio station. Some days were better than others. The days I didn't feel the isolation so keenly were the days I looked forward to. But mostly, I just kept my eyes on the road, focused on the task at hand. That night, however, was different. I remember it like it was yesterday. I had just crossed the state line into Virginia, a little after midnight. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made your breath visible in the night sky. It wasn't unusual for me to drive at night. The roads were quieter, and there was less traffic. I found it peaceful, almost therapeutic, and I relished the solitude that came with the late hours. The only thing that broke the stillness was the rhythmic sound of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rumble of the engine as it powered through the winding roads. I had just passed a truck stop and was heading towards the next one when I noticed something odd in my rearview mirror. It was a set of headlights, too close for comfort, trailing me at a steady pace. At first, I didn't think much of it. There were always other drivers on the road, and sometimes people just wanted to stick to the same pace as you. But something about this felt different. The headlights were always there, no matter how fast I went, no matter how many turns I took. It wasn't until I reached the next rest stop that I began to feel a creeping sense of unease. I pulled into the parking lot, rolled the truck to a stop, and climbed out for a quick break. I stretched my legs and headed into the diner for some coffee. I wasn't expecting to see anyone I knew. Most truckers I recognized were still on the road or already on their rest breaks. But as I stood at the counter, waiting for my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned to glance out the window. And there it was again, those headlights, parked across the lot, facing my truck. It was just a random truck, I told myself. There were plenty of trucks at this stop. But still, the feeling gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever was driving that truck had been following me for miles. It was the kind of thought that made you uneasy, but seemed ridiculous when you said it out loud. So, I kept quiet, ordered my coffee, and tried to push the thought out of my mind. I finished my break quickly and headed back to my truck. The strange feeling lingered, but I chalked it up to too much time on the road. As I climbed into the cab, I saw that the truck was still there. The headlights were off now, but the vehicle was parked in the same spot, just sitting there. No one had gotten out, and there was no movement. I couldn't see the driver. I tried to tell myself it was just another trucker, maybe taking a nap or grabbing a bite inside. But the longer I stared at the truck, the more unsettled I became. I didn't want to overthink it. I got in, started the engine, and rolled out of the lot. The strange truck remained in my mirror, but I didn't pay it any more attention. I had miles to go before I could stop again. But as I turned onto the highway and began my journey south, I noticed something else. The truck, the one that had been sitting at the rest stop, was now behind me. I wasn't sure if it had pulled out right after I did, or if it had been there the whole time, but it was definitely following me now. It wasn't tailgating me, but it was keeping a steady distance close enough that I couldn't shake the feeling that it was deliberately staying behind me. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just another truck on the road. Maybe we were on the same route. Maybe they were headed to the same place. I had no reason to be paranoid, I told myself. But as the miles passed and the truck stayed with me, I couldn't help but wonder if something was wrong. As the hours stretched on that night, I tried my best to focus on the road ahead. The truck behind me, though still there, felt more and more like a shadow in my rearview mirror. Every now and then, I'd glance back, and the headlights would be right where they had been before following, but not overtaking. The road stretched on through the winding hills of Virginia, and the further I drove, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't that I was afraid of being followed. In all my years of driving, I'd learned to keep my cool, to stay sharp, and to trust my instincts. But the truck's consistent presence was starting to itch at the back of my mind. It was just too deliberate, too perfect. Whoever was behind me wasn't acting like your average driver. They weren't speeding up to pass or slowing down to give me space. They just sat there like a ghost, matching my pace every time I adjusted my speed. It wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing more than a coincidence, that it was just another truck on a long stretch of highway. But the longer I kept driving, the harder it was to ignore the feeling that something was off. And then it happened. The first sign that this wasn't just in my head. I was passing a small, rundown gas station, one of those places where the lights flicker and the gas pumps seem like they haven't been used in years. There was no one at the pumps, and the place was completely silent, save for the hum of my engine and the soft radio static filling the cab. As I glanced into the side mirror, I saw the truck. It was still behind me, but this time, something was different. The headlights were flickering. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, maybe a flash of light from a passing vehicle or a momentary fault in the truck's lights. But then it happened again, more deliberately this time. The truck's headlights flickered in the same pattern, as if someone was playing with the switch. A subtle, almost rhythmic flicker. A chill ran down my spine. I had no explanation for it. I had been driving this route for years, and I'd never seen anything like this before. I tried to brush it off. There had to be a logical explanation, right? Maybe the truck was malfunctioning. Maybe they were just trying to adjust their headlights or get my attention for some reason. But as I kept driving, the truck seemed to draw closer, just slightly. Not enough to make me panic, but enough to make me feel like I was being pushed, like they wanted me to know they were still there. I pulled into the next rest stop, hoping for a break. I needed to clear my head and get some air. I had just finished a long stretch of highway, and the fatigue was starting to weigh on me. I parked in the lot next to a few other trucks and climbed out of the cab. The cold night air hit me, and I took a deep breath. The quiet was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the hum of the highway. I walked into the diner to grab some coffee, hoping the warmth and the comfort of routine would help calm my nerves. But as soon as I walked in, the uneasy feeling returned. It wasn't the kind of feeling you could explain to someone, but I just knew something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. I glanced around the diner. There were a few truckers scattered at tables, mostly keeping to themselves, absorbed in their own worlds. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. The same truck that had been following me was parked outside, across the lot. It was parked far enough away that I wasn't sure if the driver had noticed me, but the truck was facing mine. The headlights were off now, but the truck was positioned in such a way that it had a clear line of sight to my rig. There was no sign of movement from the driver. No one got out of the truck, and no one seemed to be paying it any attention. It was just sitting there. My heart started to race. I walked over to the counter, ordered a cup of coffee, and tried my best to focus on something else. But my mind kept drifting back to the truck. What was going on? Was I just imagining things? I glanced out the window again, but the truck was still there, unmoving, almost waiting. Waiting for something. I wasn't sure what. I tried to push the thought aside, telling myself that it was just another trucker, maybe someone who had parked in a spot they thought was convenient. But deep down, I knew this was more than that. I had been driving long enough to recognize when something was off, and this was definitely off. I finished my coffee and made my way back to the truck. As I stepped outside, I noticed the truck was still parked across the lot. But now, something else caught my attention, something I hadn't noticed before. There was a piece of paper stuck to the windshield. I couldn't make out the writing from where I was, but the sight of it sent a wave of unease through me. Why would someone leave a note on a truck that wasn't theirs? And why was it on the windshield of the truck that had been following me? I approached the truck cautiously, my heart beating faster with every step. As I got closer, I realized that the note wasn't just some random piece of paper. It looked like it had been deliberately placed there. I reached out and grabbed it, hesitating for a moment before unfolding it. The note was simple, handwritten in block letters. "I'm right behind you." My blood ran cold. I stood there for a moment, staring at the words, feeling a wave of panic wash over me. Who could have left this? How did they know? And why was I being followed? There were so many questions, and none of them had answers. I looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone, anyone who might have seen me. But the parking lot was empty. There were no signs of the driver. No other vehicles pulling out. Just me and this damn truck that seemed to be everywhere I went. I quickly crumpled the note in my hand and threw it in the trash, as if getting rid of it would somehow make the situation go away. But it didn't. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, and my hands were shaking as I climbed back into my truck. I started the engine, my eyes scanning the lot, but the truck was still there, unmoving. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. As I pulled out of the rest stop and back onto the highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The headlights were back, still behind me, still following me. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. I wasn't just imagining things. Someone was out there, and they weren't going away. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my knuckles white. The truck was still behind me, as it had been for hours now. But this time, I wasn't just unsettled. I was scared. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the cab, a steady thrum that kept my mind anchored to the task at hand. But as the miles stretched on, the truck behind me seemed to close in. It wasn't just following anymore. It felt like it was closing in. There was a palpable shift in the air, an oppressive weight that hung over me as I tried to focus on the road. Every time I glanced in the mirror, the truck was there, right behind me, its headlights gleaming through the dark like a pair of eyes watching my every move. I tried not to let it get to me. After all, I had driven countless nights like this, with nothing more than the steady hum of tires on asphalt to keep me company. But this time, the quiet was suffocating. Every shift of the wheel, every glance in the mirror, felt like a small, suffocating surrender. The truck behind me, its headlights burning bright against the blackness of the road, seemed to be waiting for something. And as the hours dragged on, it was clear that something wasn't right. I pulled into another truck stop around 3 a.m. I needed to stretch my legs, grab something hot to drink, and clear my mind. The lot was nearly empty, save for a few other trucks scattered around the perimeter. There was no sign of life in the diner, and the gas pump stood silent under the flickering lights. The truck behind me, as always, was parked across the lot. Its headlights were off now, but I could feel it there, like a shadow creeping in my peripheral vision. The feeling of being watched had become impossible to shake. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the diner, my boots clicking on the pavement with a dull echo. The cool night air was biting, and it did little to soothe the unease gnawing in my insides. As I reached for the door of the diner, something caught my eye, a glint of metal in the distance. I froze. Across the lot, at the edge of the dimly lit parking area, I saw it. The truck. But this time, there was something more. The driver's side window was down, fully down. The truck was still, but in the cold night air, the act of leaving a window open struck me as bizarre. No one would leave their window down in this weather. Not even a fool would. It just didn't make sense. My instincts screamed at me, but I forced myself to walk inside, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. Inside, the diner was as dead as the outside. The lone waitress behind the counter barely looked up as I slid onto a stool. The coffee was lukewarm, bitter, and tasteless, but I drank it anyway, needing the moment of calm. But all I could focus on was the truck outside, its window still down. After a few minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore. I stood up, dropped a few bills on the counter, and left. The cool air greeted me as I stepped outside, but it did nothing to quell the chill running through my veins. I made my way back to the truck, my eyes constantly scanning the lot, but the truck was still there. Still, watching. As I climbed into the cab, I noticed something strange. The paper note that had been on my windshield earlier, the one I had crumpled up in a ball and thrown in the trash, was lying on the passenger seat. At first, I thought I was losing it. Maybe I had left it there when I was in a hurry to get back on the road. But the truth hit me like a cold slap. The note had been thrown away, but it was back. I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. My breathing quickened. This couldn't be real. There was no way. I had thrown the note away. I had seen it disappear into the trash. But now, here it was again, perfectly intact, sitting on the seat like a reminder. I unfolded it carefully, and my heart stopped when I saw the same message, written in block letters. I'm still behind you. I slammed the truck into gear and pulled out of the rest stop with a speed I hadn't intended. My mind raced. Whoever this was, they were messing with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just following anymore. This felt personal. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the night like an open wound. My headlights cast long shadows on the asphalt, and every time I glanced in the mirror, I saw the truck. It was still behind me, always behind me, no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. As I neared the outskirts of a small town, I turned off the main highway onto a more isolated back road, hoping the change in route would shake whoever was tailing me. The truck didn't change its course. It stayed right behind me, just as it had before, like a shadow glued to my tail. The silence in the cab was suffocating, and my skin prickled with every mile. I kept looking back, but the truck was still there. But this time, there was something else. The headlights seemed brighter now, more intense, almost as if the truck was getting closer. Too close. The idea of pulling over crossed my mind, but the thought of stopping or getting out of the truck filled me with a sick sense of dread. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, trying to break free of the fear tightening around my chest. But the truck behind me matched my speed. It wasn't speeding up or slowing down. It was just there, always there. The sound of tires on the road seemed to echo in my ears as I pushed the rig faster, my fingers stiff on the wheel. I rounded a bend, the road narrowing as I entered a stretch of forested area, where the trees leaned in from both sides. The headlights from the truck behind me illuminated the dark shadows of the trees, casting long, grotesque silhouettes along the side of the road. The air in the cab grew thicker. The truck was still there, always there. But then, something strange happened. As I passed a small bridge, the truck's headlights flickered again, just like they had that first night. This time, it wasn't a simple flicker. It was as if the truck was trying to signal me a quick flash, then off. Then another quick flash. And then a single, long blink of the headlights, as if it were saying something. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was hammering in my chest. I needed to know who was behind me, why they were doing this. I pulled over to the side of the road, my truck's tires crunching on the gravel. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't get out. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring into the rearview mirror. And then I saw it. The truck's headlights turned off, one by one. It was still behind me, but it was waiting now, waiting for something. I felt a cold, irrational terror run through my veins as I sat frozen in place. Suddenly, the cab light above me flickered, and I heard a faint tapping on the window. I jerked my head to the side. My breath caught in my throat. There, just outside the window, was the reflection of someone. Someone who shouldn't have been there. The tapping continued, rhythmic, insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. I didn't dare roll down the window. I didn't dare move. I just stared at the figure in the glass. It was a man, tall, dark-haired, with a face I couldn't quite make out, obscured by the dim glow from the headlights. But I could see the outline of his hand, fingers drumming against the window. In the eerie silence, the tapping grew louder, as if he was counting down. And with each tap, my fear grew. This wasn't a game. Whoever was behind me, they weren't just following, they were playing with me. And I was trapped in the middle of it all. I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest, every thud deafening in the silence of the night. The man outside my truck was still there, his fingers gently drumming against the window with a chilling rhythm, each tap sending a shockwave of terror through my body. I felt as though the world had narrowed down to just that one moment, the low hum of the truck engine, the cold metal of the steering wheel, and the tapping that was slowly driving me mad. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to start the engine and get the hell out of there. But my body refused to obey. It was as though I had been paralyzed, unable to escape the reality of what was happening. I took a shaky breath, my throat tight. I forced myself to glance at the man in the window, my eyes flickering over his features in the dim light. His face was still shadowed, but now I could see something more clearly, a twisted grin stretching across his face like a grotesque mask. His eyes were dark, and though I couldn't see them fully, I could feel them staring straight into me. It was as though he was seeing through me, looking into the very depths of my soul. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive away, but I was frozen in place. The tapping stopped, and I held my breath, waiting. Everything was eerily still. The truck behind me was no longer visible in my rearview mirror. The lights had gone out, leaving only darkness behind me. The air inside the cab felt suffocating. I glanced to my side, and for a split second, I thought I saw the shadow of a figure move just outside the door. My stomach twisted into knots, and I jerked my head back to the front windshield. I was losing my mind. Suddenly, the man outside stepped back. He didn't move far, just a few paces, but it was enough for me to see his full silhouette in the pale moonlight. He was tall, wearing a long coat that billowed slightly in the wind. I felt like I was seeing a ghost, some kind of twisted apparition that shouldn't have been there at all. But he was. He was real. Then he did something that shook me to my core. He reached into the air and, with an almost deliberate motion, pointed to the sky. I didn't understand what he meant, but I knew something wasn't right. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and my breath came in short bursts. I wasn't sure if it was the cold night air or the terror building inside me, but I felt as though my chest was caving in. Without warning, the man stepped back further, disappearing into the blackness of the road behind me. For a moment, I thought I was finally free of him. But then I saw it, the truck. The truck that had been following me for miles, its headlights flickering to life once more. It was still there, but now it was no longer distant. It was closer than I had ever seen it. The truck's lights flickered again, this time in a pattern, a Morse code-like sequence that sent a cold wave of realization through my spine. I stared at the headlights, struggling to understand, but the answer came to me in a rush. This was no coincidence. The man outside, the truck following me, it was all connected. The truck pulled closer, its engine growling in the quiet of the night. My blood ran cold. There was something menacing about the way it inched forward, as though it had been waiting for this moment to strike. Then, as if on cue, the man reappeared in my side mirror. His face was inches from the window now, his breath fogging up the glass. I could see his eyes dark, empty pits that seemed to absorb everything around them. And that grin, that awful grin that stretched wider, almost unnatural. He tapped on the glass again, once, twice, 3 times. Each tap was like a hammer blow to my sanity. I couldn't take it anymore. Panic surged through me, flooding my veins with adrenaline. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, spinning the wheel to the left, trying to escape, trying to outrun whatever nightmare was chasing me. The tires squealed against the gravel, throwing dust into the air as I swerved, nearly losing control of the truck. But the truck behind me didn't let up. It matched my every move, its headlights flashing like a beacon in the night. I could feel the presence of the truck, like a predator stalking its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. The closer I got to the next bend in the road, the tighter the grip of fear became. I had no choice but to keep driving, to keep running. I glanced at the rearview mirror, my pulse quickening. The man was there, too, standing in the middle of the road now, blocking my path. His figure was tall, too tall, and I could see his coat billowing behind him like a cloak. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, but there was nowhere to go. The man stepped forward slowly, his feet moving like they were in time with the truck's engine. He was keeping pace with me, matching my speed. I had no idea what he wanted, but I knew he wasn't just some random lunatic. There was purpose behind his every action. The truck behind me, the strange encounter at the diner, the note left on my seat, it was all building toward this moment. But I still didn't understand why. Desperation clawed at me. I swerved again, pulling hard on the wheel, hoping to lose him in the trees, hoping to find some way out. But no matter what I did, the truck stayed right behind me, and the man remained in my mirror, closer now, closer than ever. As I hit the next stretch of road, I slammed my foot down even harder. The engine roared to life, and I pushed the truck as fast as it could go. But the headlights of the truck in my rearview mirror only grew brighter, and the man? He was still there, moving with terrifying precision, keeping up with me no matter how fast I went. I had to stop. I had to face whatever this was, whatever nightmare had come to claim me. I slammed the brakes hard, forcing the truck to screech to a halt. The truck behind me did the same, coming to a stop with a shudder. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. And then, in the dead of night, there was silence. The man was gone. The truck was gone. For a long moment, I just sat there, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my fingers were numb. The world felt unreal, as though I had slipped into some twisted dream. But then I heard it. A voice. Not from outside, but from inside my truck. It whispered in the back of my mind, as if the air itself was speaking to me. You can't run anymore. The blood drained from my face, and my heart stopped beating. The voice wasn't human. It was something else, something dark, something old. I turned slowly to look over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Only the empty road behind me. I wasn't alone anymore. The man wasn't gone. The truck wasn't gone. They were still there, watching, waiting. I had just become part of something far worse than I could have imagined. The truck sat eerily still in the dead of night, its engine quiet now, as though it, too, was holding its breath. I stared at the empty road ahead, my pulse still racing, but I didn't know what to do. The voice had echoed in my mind, and no matter how I tried to shake it, it lingered. It wasn't just the truck, the man, or even the things I'd witnessed that night. It was the sense of being followed, of being trapped, and it wouldn't let go. My mind raced. My body screamed at me to move, to drive away, but my legs refused to cooperate. I was frozen. The fear that had paralyzed me earlier now coursed through my veins, burning in my chest, leaving me numb. I had no answers, no explanations. All I had was a feeling that something had shifted, something beyond my comprehension. I glanced over my shoulder again. The truck was still there, the blackened road stretching out behind me, empty. No figures, no headlights, just silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was alone. I took a deep breath and grabbed the door handle, pushing myself out of the cab. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I shivered involuntarily. The night felt heavier now, the weight of whatever was happening pressing in on me, making each breath a struggle. The dim glow of the moon cast a pale light over the surroundings, but it was still as if the world had turned into a ghost town. I glanced up at the sky, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread settle in. The stars above twinkled faintly, but even they felt distant, unreachable, as if they were mocking me. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, but the fear didn't go away. It had a grip on me, a vice that wouldn't loosen. I looked back at the truck, considering my options. It felt wrong, like staying there would invite whatever had been following me to return. But where else could I go? I couldn't just drive off into the night without knowing if I was still being watched. My thoughts were fractured, and I needed to make a decision. I walked around the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel beneath me. The place was silent. Too silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. The air was thick with the sense of something unseen. I felt it in the eyes. The eyes that I knew were on me, hidden somewhere in the shadows. I needed to leave. I had to get out of here before it all came crashing down. I slid back into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, the sound loud in the stillness. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, but I forced myself to start the engine. The truck rumbled to life, but it felt like I was driving deeper into something I couldn't escape. I put the truck in gear and slowly started moving down the road, my eyes darting from the mirrors to the road ahead. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the long, winding stretch of asphalt. For a moment, I thought I was clear. But then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was that feeling again, the one that had gnawed me for miles, for days. I wasn't alone. The truck that had followed me wasn't behind me anymore, but I knew it was still there. I could feel it. I could feel its presence, just out of sight, lurking. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The speedometer crept higher, but I didn't care. I just needed to be away from that place. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see the headlights of the truck appear. But there was nothing, just darkness. I exhaled in relief, my heart slowing down, though the fear hadn't completely dissipated. The road ahead was clear now, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I could at least leave it behind. I was heading toward the next town, toward the familiar, where things could return to normal. But as I continued driving, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold something. Every sound felt amplified. The silence was unnerving. The usual hum of the engine, the whir of the tires on the road, it was all wrong. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if something was truly out there, still following. I pushed on, unwilling to acknowledge the growing unease in my chest. I passed through towns and small clusters of houses, each one offering a brief glimpse of normality before the road stretched out again, empty and endless. Each turn, each mile, felt like an eternity, as though I was moving further away from reality. It wasn't until I reached the next service station that I pulled over, exhaustion settling in like a weight across my shoulders. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The fatigue was overpowering. I parked the truck, shut off the engine, and sat there in the stillness. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of everything, but the truth was, I couldn't. There were no answers, no way to rationalize what had happened. All I had were the lingering memories, the man outside my truck, the truck that followed, the voice that spoke in my mind. I stepped out and went inside to grab something to drink. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, and the sound of the door chiming as it opened felt oddly loud. A few people milled around, and the familiar normalcy of the place did little to ease the strange feeling gnawing at me. I asked the attendant about the road I had just driven on, casually mentioning the strange truck I'd seen in my mirrors. He glanced up at me, his expression blank. "That road's always been quiet, especially at night," he said, his voice low, as if he were speaking more to himself than to me. I nodded, forcing a smile, and left without saying another word. As I climbed back into the truck, I looked around one more time at the station, at the surrounding buildings, and then back out toward the road. Nothing seemed out of place. But as I looked at the dark stretch of highway ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That I had changed. The man, the truck, the whispers, it wasn't over. But I had to keep moving. I had no choice but to push forward. And as I drove off into the night, my eyes scanning the darkness around me, I realized that I might never truly be free of it. The road ahead was long, but whatever had been following me, whatever had crossed state lines and shadowed my every move, was out there. And it wasn't finished with me yet. But for now, I would keep driving and hope that someday the road would take me far enough away that I could finally put it behind me. It was the only thing I could do. It was around 11 p.m. when I stepped into the store for my shift, just as the last of the evening customers filed out. It was the usual routine. Unlock the back door, grab the keys to the register, and begin prepping for the long hours ahead. It was one of those late-night retail jobs you take just to make ends meet, with long stretches of silence and the occasional oddball customer who wanted something strange at the most inconvenient hour. But I didn't mind. The hours passed slowly, and the money helped pay the bills. This wasn't a fancy store. It wasn't even a chain. It was one of those mom-and-pop places tucked in a quiet corner of the city. The kind of place that only gets attention when something breaks or goes missing. And that's what made it perfect. I could do my work, listen to music, and the time would fly by. My manager, an older guy named Peter, was a night owl too, but he mostly kept to himself. He'd leave me to handle the store while he roamed the back, checking inventory or doing who knows what. And if I needed something, I could always ask. The store itself was a bit of a mess. Shelves full of odd things, cleaning supplies, old books, knickknacks, and what seemed like an endless collection of mismatched items people dropped off over the years. It wasn't the most organized place, but it had a certain charm. In the mornings, it would be busy enough with people picking through the aisles, but come nightfall, the place would quiet down into a peaceful stillness that I didn't mind at all. As I walked through the aisles that evening, locking up and making sure everything was in place, I noticed how different the store felt once the lights were dimmed. There was something eerie about it, something unsettling. I'd never thought about it before, but now, with the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the silence surrounding me, the store seemed like it was holding secrets. The shelves cast long shadows, and the quiet was almost too perfect. It felt like there was something hidden beneath the surface of all the dust and clutter. I always prided myself on my ability to work late into the night without feeling unnerved, but that night, I felt an odd tension in the air, like something was just waiting to be noticed. I was used to working alone, but tonight, even the old, rusting cash register seemed to be watching me. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was just tired, but it wouldn't leave me. Every little creak of the floorboards under my feet, every gust of wind rattling the back door, made me more aware of the space around me. I had worked here for months, but something about tonight felt different. By the time Peter left for the night, the store was empty. I locked the door behind him and glanced around one more time, making sure everything was in order. I couldn't explain it, but the store felt heavier, as if it was trying to tell me something. The night dragged on. I busied myself with stocking shelves and organizing a few stray items. The clock ticked away, each minute feeling longer than the last. That was when I noticed something odd in the corner of the store, a shelf near the back that I hadn't paid much attention to before. It was a tall wooden thing, crammed with old books, dusty trinkets, and a few strange antiques that no one ever seemed to buy. But tonight, the shelf looked different. As I drew closer, I noticed something unusual, a small gap between two of the wooden panels. It was as though the wood had warped over the years, revealing a crack just big enough for someone to slip their fingers through. I bent down, my curiosity piqued. The crack seemed insignificant, but there was something about it that nagged at me. I tugged at the edge of the panel, but it wouldn't budge. I frowned, feeling a strange pull to see what was behind it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I felt an urge to figure it out. After a few attempts, I gave up and moved on with my night, but the crack lingered in my thoughts. Something about it felt intentional. I tried to push the thought aside, but every so often, I'd glance over at that shelf. The crack seemed to grow wider in my mind, a tiny gap that promised something more. I shook my head, trying to focus on the work at hand. But as the hours wore on, I found myself drifting back to that part of the store, my attention repeatedly drawn to the shelf in the corner. By the time it hit 2 a.m., I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was calling me to that shelf, and I knew I had to check it out. That's when everything changed. The store was still, and I was alone, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. The tick of the clock on the wall kept time as I stared at the wooden shelf in the corner, the strange crack between the panels calling me back like a magnet. The feeling I had dismissed earlier was now impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the crack anymore. It was the sensation that something in the store was changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly. And with each minute, that change seemed to be growing more real. I decided to approach the shelf again. My fingers brushed against the dust-coated wood as I leaned in closer. The gap between the panels was still there, but now the crack seemed wider. I could swear it had opened slightly since my last inspection. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was imagining it, but the nagging pull I felt earlier had only intensified. I tugged at the edge of the panel once more, this time with more force. The wood creaked in protest, but then it gave way, just enough for me to slide my fingers into the gap. My heart began to race, a strange excitement mingled with a twinge of dread. What was I doing? What was hidden in there? Before I could stop myself, I pulled the panel completely away, revealing a small, hidden compartment within the shelf. My eyes widened as I peered into the darkness beyond it. At first, all I could make out were a few dusty, forgotten objects, an old, brittle book, a tarnished key, and something wrapped in cloth that looked far too out of place for a store like this. It was almost as though the compartment had been left untouched for decades, a secret forgotten by time itself. The instant I touched the wrapped object, a cold gust of air swept through the store. It was sudden, like a breeze had rushed in from nowhere. I froze, my hand still on the claw. The lights above flickered once, and I swear I could hear the faintest sound like someone's footsteps echoing through the back hall, though I knew I was completely alone. My mind raced. It must have been the wind, right? But there were no open windows, no drafty corners. The air around me had grown colder, as if the room itself had suddenly become aware. I yanked my hand away from the cloth and stepped back. The store felt off in a way I couldn't explain. The silence now felt oppressive, like it was pressing in on me, smothering me. I glanced around, half expecting someone to appear in the aisle behind me, but of course, no one was there. It was just me, in the store, surrounded by the same dusty shelves and forgotten relics. For a moment, I considered putting the panel back and going back to my normal routine. Maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe I was just tired, the stress of working late playing tricks on my mind. But the thought of leaving something so mysterious behind me was unbearable. So I reached for the cloth again, this time pulling it back just enough to reveal what lay beneath. My breath caught in my throat. It was a small, weathered box, no bigger than a showbox, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The box itself looked ancient, covered in strange symbols that seemed to twist and turn in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. It was almost as though the symbols were moving, shifting in the dim light, but when I blinked, they would return to their original form. It didn't make sense, but the unsettling feeling only grew stronger as I stared at it. Without thinking, I grabbed the box and lifted it from the compartment. The moment I touched it, I felt a strange jolt, as if a current of electricity had coursed through my fingertips. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the sensation. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself. "Just your imagination." But as I moved to place the box on the counter, I felt the air grow even colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one there. The back door remained closed, just as it had been all evening. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was slowly creeping over me, but it wasn't easy. I had worked alone in this store countless times, but tonight felt different. The unease that had settled in my chest seemed to grow with every passing minute. Was it the box? Was it something else? I didn't know, but something was definitely wrong. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the box in my hands. A part of me wanted to put it back in the compartment, lock the panel, and pretend like none of this had ever happened. But another part of me, something darker, was urging me to open it, to find out what lay inside. I set the box down on the counter, and as I did, I noticed a strange pattern on the floor in front of me. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I realized it was something much more unusual. Footprints, but they weren't mine. They were fresh, the soles of the shoes still visible in the dust. I hadn't seen anyone walk in the store since Peter left hours ago. The prints led from the back of the store to the counter where I stood, and then they stopped. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. The air was heavier now, thick with tension. I was on edge, unsure of what to do next. Should I investigate the prints? Should I open the box? It felt like I was caught in some sort of trap, unable to escape. I turned back to the box, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for it. The urge to know what was inside, to understand what had been hidden for so long, was overwhelming. As my fingers brushed the lid, the temperature in the room dropped again, and I heard it, a low, almost inaudible sound. It was like a whisper, but not from anyone around me. It was coming from the walls, from deep within the store, as if the building itself was trying to communicate. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach was enough. Something was wrong. Something was horribly wrong. But it was too late to stop now. I had already opened the box, and whatever lay inside, I couldn't unsee it. The instant I opened the box, I felt a chill settle over me, a sensation so cold it was as if the temperature of the entire room had dropped several degrees. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, but there was another sound that seemed to fill the space, a faint creaking, like the building itself was sighing under the weight of something ancient and heavy. Inside the box, nestled in the yellowed cloth, was a small object, an ornate key, no bigger than a thumb. It was made of tarnished metal, its shape unfamiliar. Unlike any key I had seen before, it seemed to shimmer under the dim light of the store, its surface catching the light in an eerie way. It almost looked as if it was alive, pulsing faintly with some unseen energy. I held it in my hand for only a moment before I heard it again, the faint creaking sound, this time louder and more distinct. It came from somewhere behind me, from the darkened hallway leading to the back of the store. My heart thudded in my chest, and for the first time that night, I felt a sharp, undeniable sense of fear. I quickly set the key back into the box, but the creaking sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more pronounced, and then I felt its footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking in the shadows, just out of sight. I spun around, my pulse racing. The back hallway was still empty, the door to the back office closed, just as it had been before. I stood frozen, my eyes darting around the store, scanning the aisles. The shelves were all exactly where they had been, the air still thick with that unsettling heaviness. The only difference was the absence of sound. There was no longer the usual hum of the lights or the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet. It was as though the entire store had gone silent, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I quickly moved towards the hallway, stepping carefully to avoid the creaking floorboards. Every inch of me screamed to run, to leave the store and never look back. But something deeper, more insistent, held me there. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand what was causing this feeling, the creeping dread that had taken hold of me. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was a new noise, faint but unmistakable. It was a whisper, coming from the dark hallway. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. It was beckoning me, urging me to move closer, to step into the unknown. I took a step forward, my breath shallow and quick, the fear gnawing at me with every passing second. The hallway was bathed in shadow, the dim light from the main store barely reaching the doorframe. I could feel the cold, the oppressive silence weighing down on me, but I couldn't stop. I had to know. I had to find the source of the whispers. As I reached the end of the hallway, the door to the back office suddenly creaked open on its own. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The door had been closed earlier, no one had come through it. I hadn't even heard anyone approach. But there it was, standing ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me in. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispering seemed to grow louder, as if it was coming from inside the room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt the familiar tingle of fear running down my spine. I pushed the door open slowly, my pulse racing in my ears. The room beyond was dimly lit, the faint glow from the overhead bulb casting long shadows across the floor. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The shelves were lined with boxes, papers, and various items, just as they always were. But then I noticed it, the strange smell in the air. It wasn't something I could identify, but it was thick, almost metallic, like something had been spilled and forgotten about. I stepped further into the room, the air growing colder with each step. The floor beneath me creaked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that followed felt even more suffocating. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on the far wall. There, hidden behind a stack of old crates, was something I hadn't noticed before. A door. It was small, narrow, almost like a service entrance, and it looked old, ancient, even. The wood was warped, the edges chipped and cracked. It seemed out of place in this otherwise ordinary room, like it didn't belong. I walked toward it, drawn to it as if by some unseen force. As I reached for the doorknob, the air around me seemed to grow heavier, colder. The silence had returned, but now it was oppressive, suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in my chest, but nothing else. When I turned the doorknob, I expected resistance, but the door swung open easily, creaking as it did. Beyond it was nothing but darkness, an impenetrable blackness that stretched on, deeper than the room should have allowed. The shadows seemed to move within it, twisting and shifting, and for a moment I felt as though I was staring into something much larger. much older than the store itself. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The air was thick with dust, and the floor beneath me was uneven, like I was walking on something much older than the building above. As I moved deeper into the room, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping until I could see my breath in the dim light. Then I heard it again, the whispering. This time, it wasn't just faint. It was close, surrounding me, filling my ears. It sounded like a language I couldn't understand, the words slipping just beyond my grasp. The room seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't describe, as though something ancient and powerful was awakening, stirring in the dark corners of the room. I turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I gasped, stumbling back. The room was now pitch black, the light from the hallway completely cut off. My breathing grew erratic as I reached for the door, trying to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whispering grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. My hands trembled as I searched for some way out, but the darkness seemed to close in around me. The walls themselves felt alive, shifting, pressing in on me, and I could feel the floor trembling beneath my feet. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room fell into an unnatural silence, and I felt the weight of the airlift, the pressure easing just slightly. But it wasn't over. Not yet. I turned back to face the shadows in the corner of the room. Something was moving there, something I couldn't see but could feel. It was closer now, the sensation of eyes on me too real to ignore. And that's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a breath, a whisper, coming from the shadows. The door creaked open. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest as the door to the hidden room creaked open. The dim light from the hallway barely penetrated the dense darkness of the space before me. The walls seemed to close in, as if the entire room was breathing, exhaling slowly, patiently, as if it had been waiting for me. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, and I could feel them pulling at me, urging me to step forward, to go deeper into the unknown. But I couldn't. My legs felt like jelly, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out everything else. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of this place, but my feet refused to move. It was as if the very air around me had solidified, pinning me in place. Then I saw it, a figure. Not a person, but something else. It was standing in the far corner of the room, partially hidden in the shadows, its outline barely discernible. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze. I knew it was watching me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The longer I stared, the more it took shape. It was tall, too tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was a blur, like a shadow in the dark, but its eyes, they glowed. They were bright, piercing, and they were fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering. I could feel the heat of them, the weight of their gaze, pressing against my chest like a physical force. I tried to speak, but my voice was caught in my throat. My lips wouldn't move. My mind was racing, but I couldn't form a coherent thought. The room seemed to close in tighter, and the silence was deafening. It wasn't a quiet silence, it was a heavy silence, a silence that pressed on my ears and filled my lungs. The kind of silence that felt wrong, like it was suffocating me. And then it moved. The figure took a single step forward, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. The air grew colder, and I could feel the breath leave my body, leaving me with nothing but the icy grip of fear. I had to get out. I had to run, but my legs wouldn't move. They were frozen, locked in place. The figure took another step, its presence growing stronger, its form becoming clearer. The edges of its body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like it wasn't entirely real, like it was something born from the very shadows themselves. My breath came in short gasps, and I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. It was as if the air had thickened, choked the sound from my throat. The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing brighter with every step. I could feel the weight of its stare, its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I could feel it in my chest, the coldness of its energy settling deep inside my bones. Then it spoke. The voice that came from it wasn't like any voice I had ever heard before. It wasn't human, it wasn't even close. It was a low, guttural sound, like the grinding of stone against stone, the echo of something ancient and unknowable. It was the voice of something that had been waiting for centuries, biding its time. "You shouldn't have come," the voice rumbled, the words vibrating in the very air around me. "This place is mine. You are mine." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped by the voice, by the presence of whatever this thing was. My mind screamed at me to fight, to do something, but I couldn't even move my fingers. The figure took another step, and this time I felt it, the cold, the sheer, bone-chilling cold that emanated from it, wrapping around me, seeping into my skin. It wasn't just cold, it was a deep, unnatural cold that felt as though it was reaching into my very soul. It was as if it was draining me, taking something from me with every passing second. And then something shifted. The shadows around the figure seemed to swell, to grow, as if they were feeding off its presence. They stretched out, crawling along the walls and the floor, reaching for me, encircling me. The room seemed to bend, as if reality itself was warping, shifting. The figure's eyes burned brighter, and it took another step forward, its long, unnatural limbs reaching out, its fingers elongated and clawed. I could see the darkness swirling around it, coiling, gathering like a storm. I could feel the air around me grow heavier, thick with some invisible weight. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the voice rumbled again, its tone filled with malice. It was close now, too close. I could feel the chill of its presence in my bones, could feel its touch as if it was already upon me. Finally, my body responded. My legs, numb with terror, finally moved, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the shelves behind me. The noise rang out, sharp and jarring in the heavy silence, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its eyes burning with that unnatural, otherworldly glow. I turned, desperate to escape, to run, but the door, the exit was gone. The hallway was gone. The building itself seemed to have vanished, leaving me in this suffocating, oppressive space with no way out. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, more aggressive, and the cold was now biting, gnawing at me. The figure stepped forward once more, its shadow stretching across the room, reaching for me. "You're mine," the voice hissed again, closer now, so close that I could feel its breath on my skin, cold and foul. I felt it then, a presence, something that wasn't the figure, something else, something older and darker, pressing in from the edges of my vision. It was everywhere, in every corner, in every crack in the walls. The shadows were alive, writhing, closing in. The cold gripped me tighter, and I gasped for breath, but it wasn't enough. I could feel it in my chest. Something was squeezing, something was tightening around my heart. The shadows wrapped themselves around me, pulling me down, dragging me toward the figure that still stood motionless in the center of the room. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was consumed, swallowed whole by the darkness. But even as the world around me faded, as the last remnants of reality slipped away, I saw something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. In the distance, at the very edge of the darkness, I saw a glimmer of light. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, a shimmering promise in the pitch-black void. And then, just as quickly as the terror had come, I woke up. I was standing in the back room of the store, the door to the hidden chamber closed. The shelves were intact, the shadows normal, the cold gone. My breath was ragged, my body shaking with the aftershock of what I had just experienced. But I knew it wasn't over. The figure, the darkness, the cold, it was still there, waiting, lurking just out of sight. I hadn't escaped it. I had just been given a warning. The dim light of the back room flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the shelves as I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My breath was ragged, my body still trembling from the encounter. The air around me felt thick with something I couldn't quite grasp, a lingering presence, a weight that pressed down on me, refusing to let go. I wiped the sweat from my brow, my heart still racing, my mind in a state of chaotic disarray. The figure, the darkness, the cold, it felt as though it had all been a nightmare, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. The experience had been too real. The fear, the suffocation, the oppressive weight of the shadows, it was all real. I had felt it. It had touched me. The room around me seemed unchanged, as if nothing had shifted, but I knew better. The quiet was unsettling, the stillness unnatural. I turned toward the door that led to the rest of the store. It was locked, as it always had been, but I felt no sense of relief. No matter how normal the surroundings appeared, something had shifted. The boundaries of reality had been broken, and I wasn't sure if I could trust anything anymore. I couldn't stay here. Not with that. Things still lurking, watching, waiting. It had let me go for now, but for how long? I didn't know, and I wasn't willing to find out. I rushed toward the door, fumbling for my keys, my hands shaking as I inserted them into the lock. I could feel the darkness still clinging to me, wrapping itself around my mind, making my thoughts scatter, my senses feel dulled. But I had to get out. I had to escape this place. The door finally opened, and I stepped out into the main store area. The lights were flickering now, too, as if the building itself was unsettled, trembling with the aftershocks of something unnatural. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, the constant buzzing, but it felt wrong, out of place, like everything in this store was on the brink of collapsing into something else. I made my way to the front of the store, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. The usual sounds of the bustling retail world, the soft murmur of customers, the beeping of the cash registers were absent. The store was empty, as if everyone had suddenly disappeared. I could feel my pulse quicken as I reached the front door. The security cameras, the ones that had been mounted above the entrances, were frozen, their screens blank. It was like the entire store had been abandoned, left to rot in some forsaken corner of the world. I grasped the door handle, pulling it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I knew I hadn't locked it, and yet it was sealed shut. I backed away from it, my mind racing. There was no way out. There had to be another exit, another way to escape this place. I turned, searching frantically for an alternative, but the store seemed endless, its aisles stretching out before me, each one like a twisted labyrinth. The shelves towered around me, blocking any sense of direction. Suddenly, I heard a sound of soft scraping, almost like a whisper, coming from behind one of the shelves. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. The figure, the presence, was still here, somewhere in this place, waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, trying to gather the courage to move forward, but something inside me told me to run, to leave. I couldn't face whatever was in that darkness again. I turned and sprinted down the aisle, my shoes pounding against the concrete floor. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, my mind trying to process everything that had happened. Had it all been real? The figure in the hidden room, the cold, the shadows, it couldn't be. But deep down, I knew it was. I could still feel the chill in my bones, the unnatural weight of the darkness pressing on me. It hadn't been a dream. I reached the back of the store, where the emergency exit was located. It was the only way out. I didn't even think to check if the door was locked. I grabbed the handle and pulled with all my strength. It opened. The cold night air rushed in, filling my lungs with a deep, welcoming breath of freedom. But even as I stepped outside into the quiet of the parking lot, I felt no relief. The darkness had followed me. I could feel it in the air, a presence just beyond my sight, hovering, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hurried to my car, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine. The headlights flickered on, casting an eerie glow across the empty lot. I didn't look back as I drove away. I couldn't. I didn't know what I would see if I did. The city seemed peaceful as I drove through its empty streets, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. But something was off. The world felt out of place, as if the fabric of reality had been torn and patched together haphazardly. I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever I had encountered in that store had followed me, that it was still with me, hidden in the shadows, just beyond my reach. I couldn't stop shaking. I had to get away. But where? Where could I go to escape it? The feeling of dread hung over me like a cloud, suffocating me. I had to find a way to make sense of all of this, but I didn't know where to start. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no easy explanation, no neat resolution. Whatever had happened in that store wasn't something that could be explained away. I drove until the city gave way to the quiet, empty roads of the outskirts. My headlights swept across the trees and fields, the shadows growing longer as the night deepened. I slowed the car, pulling to the side of the road, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I sat there for a long time, just staring ahead, lost in thought. What had I uncovered? What had I seen? The hidden room, the figure, the shadows, it was all too much to process. I didn't know if I was still safe, if I was still being followed, if I was still in danger. But I had to keep going. I had to keep moving forward, because the truth was, I didn't know if I would ever be truly safe again. And as I sat there, staring into the darkness, I realized that the question wasn't if I would encounter it again, it was when. Because whatever it was, whatever I had uncovered, it was still out there, waiting. And it wasn't finished with me yet. I left the car running, the headlights cutting through the night as I drove back toward the city. The road stretched on ahead, empty and endless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The world outside my car window blurred as I sped through the empty streets, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The events of the past few days played over and over again in my head, each moment more surreal than the last. It was as if I had crossed some invisible threshold, stepping into a world that was no longer familiar, a world where the rules no longer applied. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had happened in that store had been a product of my imagination, of exhaustion, or perhaps even some strange, unexplainable coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. The terror, the coldness, the way the shadows seemed to twist and turn in that hidden room, it wasn't something I could shake off so easily. It wasn't just a bad dream. It was real. The road stretched out before me, the headlights illuminating the darkened pavement. I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. I had no clear destination, no safe haven. I had left the store behind, but the feeling of unease, the sense of being followed, had never left me. It lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, as if the very fabric of reality had been altered, twisted into something else. The thought that I might never truly be free of whatever it was that had haunted that store crept into my mind. Could it be possible? Could I carry this with me, this darkness, this malevolent force, for the rest of my life? I couldn't shake the image of that hidden room, the coldness that radiated from the walls, the sense that there was something or someone watching me from just beyond my sight. What had I stumbled upon? What had I uncovered? And more importantly, was there a way to stop it? I thought of all the unanswered questions. The figure in the room, the darkness that seemed to follow me, the inexplicable things that had happened since. The security cameras had been frozen, the door locked when it shouldn't have been, the strange noise that echoed through the aisles. It was as though the very store itself had become a gateway to something else, something beyond understanding. And that feeling, the weight of it, pressed on me now, just as strongly as it had in that hidden room. I tried to dismiss it, tried to reason my way through the madness, but it didn't work. I couldn't escape the images, the feelings, the lingering dread that something was still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. And so, I kept driving. The further I went, the more isolated I became. The quiet of the night settled over me, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of streetlights. I didn't know how long I had been driving. Time seemed to stretch and warp as if it had no real meaning anymore. Everything felt off, like the world was shifting beneath my feet, bending in strange ways that defied logic. At some point, the city's lights faded in the rearview mirror, and the world became nothing but darkness, stretching out before me in all directions. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see something or someone there. But nothing ever was. The silence was deafening. It wasn't until the road began to wind through a dense forest that I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A sign, weathered and worn, hanging crookedly from a rusted pole by the side of the road. It read, "Dead End." I slowed the car to a stop, the tires crunching against the gravel beneath them. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees towering like silent sentinels, blocking out most of the moonlight. I felt a sudden chill, a wave of unease creeping up my spine. Something was wrong here, something I couldn't quite explain. I had never seen this sign before, and yet it felt oddly familiar, like I had been here before in some other life, some other time. I turned the car around, but as I did, I noticed something in the distance, a faint glow. It wasn't the usual glow of city lights or street lamps. This was something different, something unnatural. It pulsed, steady and unyielding, like a heartbeat. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my heart racing once more. I drove toward the glow, unable to resist the pull. As I got closer, I saw that it was coming from the direction of an old, abandoned building. The structure was decaying, its windows shattered and boarded up, its walls covered in vines and moss. But there was something about it, something in the air around it, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I parked the car, the engine's hum dying as I cut the ignition. I sat there for a moment, just staring at the building, the eerie glow still emanating from within. I should have left, should have turned the car around and driven away, but I couldn't. I had to know. I had to see what was inside. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and made my way toward the building. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very earth beneath me was pulling me toward it. The air was cold, the wind carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. As I approached the entrance, I could hear the faintest sound scraping, almost like something dragging across the floor inside. My pulse quickened, and I hesitated for a moment, but the pull of curiosity was too strong to resist. I reached for the door, which hung loosely on its hinges, and pushed it open. Inside, the glow was even more intense, filling the room with an unnatural light. The walls were covered in strange symbols, markings I couldn't recognize, as though the building itself had been the site of something dark and forbidden. And there, in the center of the room, was a large wooden crate. It was the same crate I had seen in the store, the one that had been hidden behind the shelves, the same one that had held the darkness. I froze, my blood running cold as I realized the truth. Whatever had been unleashed in that store, whatever had followed me, had come from here. This place, this building, was its source. And now, standing before it, I understood that I was no longer just a witness to the horror. I was a part of it. I took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The glow intensified, and the shadows in the room seemed to writhe and twist. The crate began to shake, the lid rattling as if something inside was trying to break free. I knew I had no escape. And then, everything went black. I woke up on the side of the road, my car parked a few miles away. The world around me seemed unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something had followed me. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The store, the building, the darkness, it was all still out there. It was one of those nights when the world outside felt still, like everything was holding its breath. The kind of night when the stars shone bright, but the cold seemed to seep in just a little more than usual. I was working my shift at a small, rundown gas station on the outskirts of town, a place that not many people bothered to stop at. It was the kind of station where the air always smelled a little like gasoline, and the flickering lights above the pumps never quite seemed to work right. If you drove by, you'd probably think it was abandoned, even though it wasn't. It was quiet, isolated, and sometimes I get the feeling that time itself moved slower in that place. I'd been working the night shift for a few months. Most nights were uneventful, like clockwork. I'd check the pumps, clean the counters, make sure the coffee was hot enough for anyone passing through. It was the kind of job that gave you too much time to think, too much time to observe the small details. The weather, the stars, the patterns in the empty parking lot, the hum of the neon lights. Sometimes I'd get the feeling that I was the only one awake in the world. And that wasn't a feeling I particularly liked, but I got used to it. That night started out like any other. I pulled my coat tighter against the chill, watching the headlights of distant cars illuminate the lonely highway. No one ever really stopped for gas at this hour, except for the occasional trucker or someone who had a long drive ahead of them. I'd gotten used to the silence, but even then, it was unsettling. You could hear your own thoughts too clearly when there wasn't anything else to drown them out. The station was old, built decades ago, when this part of town still had a little more life to it. Now it was surrounded by empty fields and forests. People passed by, but they rarely stopped. There was nothing out here but the highway and the occasional wild animal scurrying by. And then, of course, there was me. Just a guy manning the counter in a place most people would never even think to visit. My names. Well, it doesn't really matter. But what does matter is what happened that night. What I saw, what I heard, and what didn't come. It was just past midnight when I noticed a set of headlights coming down the long, empty stretch of road. At first, it was like any other car passing by, a brief moment of light on the horizon. But then, something felt off. The car wasn't stopping, even though it seemed like it was getting closer, closer to the station. My eyes narrowed as I stared through the window, waiting. Was this someone who needed gas? Or maybe someone just passing through like all the others? But as the car drew nearer, I noticed something strange. The headlights didn't seem to blink or flicker like they usually did when cars slowed down. No, these lights stayed steady, unwavering, as if they were coming straight at me. I could hear the soft hum of the engine, and for a moment, it felt like the air itself had thickened. I could almost feel the vibrations of the tires rolling over the asphalt. But when the car should have been at the station, when I should have been able to see the outline of it in the dark, the headlights so close that they almost seemed to be right outside. The window, nothing came. The lights just vanished. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of it. Could I have misjudged the distance? Maybe it was another car, maybe a truck. I turned my gaze back out the window. Nothing. The road was empty again. No lights. No car. It was as if the vehicle had just disappeared. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions, especially in a place like this. It was probably just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But then again, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stood there, staring at the dark road, waiting for a few more minutes. Nothing. The night remained silent, just the soft rustle of wind in the trees. Maybe it was nothing. I told myself to calm down and went back to my work, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had crept up on me. But deep down, something told me that this night was going to be different. That's when the first strange thing happened. A few minutes later, the sound of a car pulling into the lot broke the silence. I looked up, ready to greet a customer, but there was nothing in sight. No headlights, no engine noise, just the sudden sound of tires rolling over gravel. I glanced around, wondering if maybe someone had pulled up from the other side of the station where the lights were dimmer. But as I stepped out, I saw nothing. No car, just empty pavement. My heart rate picked up a little. I stood there in the cold, scanning the lot once more, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel beneath me. It was unnerving. The sense that something was off. but there was no clear answer. The night dragged on, heavy with silence. After the headlights vanished and the strange sensation had settled deep in my chest, I couldn't help but glance out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see that same set of lights cutting through the dark. But nothing came. I returned to my routine, trying to keep myself busy with tasks around the station. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder now, almost invasive in its bright monotony. As I wiped down the counters and glanced at the clock, 1:30 a.m., my mind kept drifting back to that odd moment, that brief sense of something wrong. But it was just a trick of the mind, right? I told myself it had to be. The night had been too quiet, too still, and when you spend enough time in a place like this, the quiet plays games with your head. I needed to shake it off, and so I did. I made another pot of coffee, even though I knew no one would come by to drink it. I cleaned the counter. I checked the windows. Everything seemed normal again, or at least it appeared normal. I don't know when exactly it started, but it was subtle. I began hearing noises in the background. At first, I thought it was just the wind of the trees scraping against the station's outer walls, the soft tapping of branches. But the sounds didn't quite match up. The wind, yes, but it wasn't just the wind. There was something else. A scrape, like metal dragging against the ground. Or was it just the tired creak of the old wooden beams above me? It wasn't that I couldn't tell the difference. I knew what I was hearing, but I didn't want to admit it. The sound was rhythmic, steady, like something or someone was pacing outside. Every few minutes, I'd hear it again, just beyond the windows. The shuffle of footsteps. And then, nothing. Silence. I pushed it out of my mind, telling myself it was just the wind again. But this time, it didn't feel like the wind. The sound wasn't irregular, like gusts of wind, but a slow, deliberate pace, as though someone were walking around the station, just out of sight. I stood at the counter, trying to ignore it, but I couldn't. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked over to the window, parting the blinds slowly to peer outside. There was nothing. The lot was empty, the old, cracked asphalt stretching out under the pale light of the station's glow. I stared out, my breath fogging up the glass as I waited. For what? For a car? For the sound to stop? I don't know, but the uneasy feeling stayed, nagging at the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. I stepped away from the window, trying to shake off the tension. Maybe I was just being paranoid, letting my nerves get the best of me. It was late, and I hadn't had much sleep lately. I sat back down at the counter, staring at the clock. 2:15 a.m. The minutes seemed to crawl by. And then, just as I thought I might have imagined it all, it came again. The sound. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight, walked toward the door, and pushed it open, my boots crunching against the gravel. The cold hit me instantly, a sharp gust of air biting into my skin. I turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the empty lot. Nothing. No car, no person, no sign of anything unusual. But there, on the far side of the lot, I noticed something odd. The air seemed thicker over by the old, rusted fence. It was hard to explain, but it was as if the shadows themselves were darker in that spot. I swallowed hard, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I stepped closer. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. I kept the beam focused ahead of me, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it just my mind playing tricks again? Maybe it was nothing, but then I noticed it just for a split second, a fleeting flash of something white in the corner of my eye. I froze. I swung the flashlight toward the movement, but when I reached the spot, the area was empty. Nothing. My heart raced in my chest, my hands suddenly clammy. I stood there for a moment, scanning the shadows. It felt as though the entire world had gone still, like I was the only living thing in a place that wasn't quite alive. The hair on my arm stood on end. Just then, I heard it again. A faint scraping sound. soft at first, but growing louder. I jumped, turning quickly toward the source. I couldn't see anything. The scraping noise stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving only the steady, rhythmic thud of my heartbeat in my ears. For the first time, I felt genuinely afraid. But I couldn't just stay out there in the cold, terrified and alone. I walked back to the door, my flashlight flickering slightly in my hand as I pushed it open and stepped back inside. The warmth of the station hit me immediately, but it didn't make me feel any better. My nerves were on edge, my stomach twisted with unease. I locked the door behind me, feeling foolish for even stepping outside in the first place. But something told me that this wasn't over. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone here. I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation playing with my mind, but I knew deep down that something else was at play. The rest of the night passed in a blur. No more sounds, no more strange occurrences. Just the slow, constant ticking of the clock as it marked the hours. But my mind wouldn't let go of the feeling that something was lurking just outside of my sight. And when the sun finally began to rise, casting its first weak rays over the dark, empty road, I couldn't help but wonder if the events of the night had been a warning. If I'd been the one who had missed something, because something was still out there waiting. I had no idea just how much stranger things were about to get. The logical part of me wanted to push it aside as nothing more than an overactive imagination, fueled by too many quiet, lonely nights. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the darkened lot outside the window, the thick shadows that seemed to shift, even when the breeze was still. I began to notice things I hadn't before, small details that in the past would have gone unnoticed, like the soft, distant hum of the wind against the fence, or the eerie creak of the station's old signs swinging gently in the night air. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, but these sounds had an unmistakable rhythm, a pattern. They weren't random. I started staying up later, long after my shift should have ended, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. The thing that I was starting to believe wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The second night after the incident, I arrived at the station around dusk. The air was thick, saturated with humidity. The evening sky bled into a deep, bruised purple, streaked with orange as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The day had been oppressive, and now, in the quiet stillness of the evening, it felt as though the world was holding its breath. I parked my truck and stepped out, feeling the weight of the heat pressing down on me. As I walked toward the station's entrance, I glanced over my shoulder, my gaze instinctively moving toward the far side of the lot. The familiar silence greeted me, but there was something else, something different. A faint flicker of light. It was barely visible, just a glimmer at the corner of my vision. It disappeared quickly, like a star burning out. But it wasn't the light that made my heart skip. It was the distinct sense that someone or something was watching. I stood there for a long time, unmoving, listening to the quiet hum of the world around me, the rustle of leaves, the soft groan of the wind through the trees. I shook off the feeling and headed inside, trying to push it all to the back of my mind. I couldn't. The feeling was always there, hanging just over my shoulder, like a shadow I couldn't escape. That night, as I worked the counter, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like an intrusion. I couldn't stop glancing toward the window, half expecting to see a pair of headlights cutting through the dark. But nothing came. Around midnight, I heard it again. The scraping noise. It started softly, like distant footsteps dragging across the gravel. I stood motionless, listening. The sound came again, this time louder, clearer. It was closer. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed to the window. There, at the far end of the lot, just beyond the reach of the station's light, I saw something moving. A figure, or maybe it was just the shadow of something. It shifted, fluid and deliberate. I couldn't make out any details, no shape or form, just the unmistakable sense that something was there. I wasn't alone. I backed away from the window, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind raced. What was it? Was it a person? A car? I had no idea. The scraping sound continued. It wasn't rhythmic this time. It was frantic, like something desperate. The sound was moving toward the door. My breath quickened, and I felt the urge to run, to bolt out of the station and make a break for it. But I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot, a magnetic pull that I couldn't explain. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to think rationally. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the wind had knocked something over outside. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. I wasn't stupid. The sound stopped abruptly. Complete silence. Not even the wind stirred. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever it was had disappeared. But then, a sudden noise, a thud, came from the back of the station, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed to the back door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air in the small room felt suffocating, thick with the smell of oil and gasoline. As I reached the back door, I hesitated, my hand on the handle. The dragging sound stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I flung the door open, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The back of the station was empty, just old crates and a stack of empty fuel cans. The shadows were deep back here, but I couldn't see anything. And yet, I felt it. The tension in the air, the feeling that something was just out of sight, waiting. I turned around, scanning the dark parking lot through the back window. There was nothing there, no car, no movement. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, just waiting. Waiting for what? It was then I heard something else, something far more unnerving. A soft tapping sound coming from the roof. I whipped around, shining the flashlight toward the ceiling. The tapping continued, faint but deliberate. My hands were shaking now, the beam of light dancing across the roof's metal panels. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something else. Something above me. I grabbed a chair, setting it beneath the roof hatch. I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to do it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something darker, something telling me that I had to find out what was up there. I climbed onto the chair, lifting the hatch with trembling hands. Nothing. The roof was empty. Just old dust, scattered debris, and the eerie silence that had filled the station for weeks. But then I saw it. A single, fresh footprint. I wasn't alone. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. But I couldn't. Something kept me here, anchored to the ground, to the fear that was rising like bile in my throat. I stood frozen, staring at the footprint, unable to process what it meant. And then the scraping noise came again. Closer this time. Louder. My flashlight flickered and then died. I was not alone. But the real question was, what was out there, waiting for me? My heart pounded in my chest, the echo of its frantic rhythm filling my ears. The flashlight flickered once more before completely dying, plunging me into absolute darkness. I froze for a moment, my breath shallow and ragged, straining to hear anything at all that would give me a clue as to what was happening. The silence, heavy and suffocating, pressed in from all sides. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my spine, my fingers numb from gripping the now useless flashlight. There was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the overwhelming quiet of the night. Then came the scraping noise again. Closer this time, unmistakable in its proximity. It scraped along the roof, relentless and slow, as though something or someone was dragging something heavy across the surface above me. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, to escape the station, but my feet felt glued to the floor, unable to move. The sound was deafening now, scraping louder with each passing second. It was as though whatever was out there was moving toward the hatch. Toward me. I backed away slowly, feeling my legs tremble beneath me. The fear was so intense, so consuming, I could hardly think straight. My only instinct was to get out of that room, to escape whatever was coming. But as I turned toward the door, I froze again. I wasn't alone in the room anymore. A figure stood in the doorway. My eyes couldn't make out the details, but I could see the outline of a person, or at least something that resembled a person. The shape was tall, lanky, its features obscured by the shadows that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. I could feel it watching me, studying me, and the terror that surged through my body was like nothing I'd ever experienced. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words wouldn't come. My throat tightened, my voice strangled by the raw fear that had taken root inside me. And then, just like that, it moved. The figure stepped forward, its long, jerky movements unnatural and unsettling. The shadows around it seemed to bend and twist, as though they were alive, pulling the figure deeper into the room. My mind screamed for me to react, to do something, but all I could do was watch, paralyzed by fear. The figure's footsteps were slow but deliberate, each one echoing in the stillness of the station. It didn't make a sound as it moved closer, just the softest of whispers from the floorboards beneath its weight. The air in the room grew colder, sharper, like the temperature was dropping with every step it took. I finally found my voice, a strangled gasp escaping from my throat. "Who are you?" The figure stopped. For a moment, everything went still. The silence was suffocating, unbearable. I thought maybe, just maybe, it hadn't heard me. But then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, just a soft, rasping sound, like the wind scraping across dry leaves, it answered, "I'm here." The words hit me like a slap to the face. They were wrong. They shouldn't have come from that thing. There was no emotion behind them, no depth. Just a hollow, empty sound that seemed to reverberate through my skull. I wanted to turn and flee. I wanted to break free of the terror that had me pinned in place. But my legs refused to obey. I was trapped, my eyes locked on the figure before me, unable to look away. The thing moved again, this time more swiftly, as though its patience had worn thin. It was closer now, so close I could feel the unnatural chill radiating from it. Its form shifted in the dim light, becoming more defined, and that was when I saw it. It wasn't human. The face, if it could even be called that, was distorted, twisted beyond recognition. Features that should have been familiar were warped, stretched out of proportion. The skin was pale, sickly, like something dead, but still somehow alive. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were empty voids, two black holes that seemed to suck the light from the room, pulling everything into their depth. I took a step back, my feet stumbling over the floor. My heart hammered in my chest, thudding painfully against my ribs. I could feel the sweat pooling at the back of my neck, my stomach churning violently. It spoke again, its voice rasping, low. "I'm waiting for you." The words didn't make sense. They weren't meant for me. There was no connection, no logic to the way it spoke. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was talking to me directly, that it was waiting for something. Something only it knew. The station felt smaller now, the walls closing in around me as the figure advanced. I was no longer alone. It was here. It was real. The cold air intensified, biting into my skin, numbing my limbs. The temperature was unbearable, but my fear outweighed everything else. I wanted to scream, to run out of the station and never look back. But even as the impulse to flee surged within me, I couldn't move. My legs were still locked in place, my body frozen with terror. The figure was now just a few feet away, towering over me. It tilted its head, those dark, empty eyes staring down at me, piercing through me. And in that moment, I saw something else. There was a crack in the thing's form, a fracture in its otherwise smooth, horrifying surface. Through the crack, I could see something. Not quite human, but not entirely alien either. A glimpse of something more, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a memory, a face, something familiar yet horrifyingly foreign. And in that moment, I understood. The figure wasn't just a creature. It was a reflection of something deeper. Something tied to this place. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled, sending a shockwave through the station. The lights flickered, dimming and brightening in a frantic rhythm. I looked around, disoriented, as the walls seemed to shift, contorting into strange angles, warping the space around me. The thing reached out, its fingers long and unnaturally thin. I felt them brush against my arm, and the cold that spread through my body was more than just physical. It was as though the touch drained me of something vital, something essential. And then, in the same breath, the figure lunged. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, and I felt the world around me implode. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of something shuffling, dragging itself across the floor, and the feeling of an icy grip around my throat. My vision went dark, my body collapsed to the ground, and everything went silent once again. But this time, I wasn't sure if the silence was a relief or the calm before something far worse. When I regained consciousness, I didn't immediately recognize where I was. The cold floor beneath me felt unfamiliar, rough against my skin, like gravel scraping against my palms. My eyes fluttered open, and for a brief, horrifying second, I wondered if I was dead. Everything felt wrong. The air was thick and heavy, and there was a strange, palpable tension in the atmosphere. It was as if the world around me was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I slowly sat up, my body stiff and sore from whatever had happened. My head throbbed, the pain sharp and disorienting. It took a few moments for my senses to fully return, for my mind to process the situation I had found myself in. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The oppressive, suffocating silence that had consumed the station before the encounter was gone. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights was gone, too. Instead, there was only the sound of my own breathing, shallow, ragged breaths that echoed through the empty station. I slowly pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaky as though I hadn't moved in hours. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest as I took in the dim surroundings. The gas station had changed. The familiar layout was now twisted, unfamiliar. The walls were cracked, stained with something that resembled old rust, and the air was thick with a musty, decaying smell that made my stomach churn. And then I saw it. The hatch. The one leading to the storage area. It was open. I couldn't remember when it had opened, but I knew one thing. I had not opened it. The last time I had checked, it had been closed. But now it hung ajar, the dark space beyond it inviting and terrifying all at once. I took a hesitant step toward it, my body screaming at me to leave, to run, to escape. But I couldn't. I needed to know what had happened. I had to understand why everything felt wrong. As I approached the hatch, I saw something on the floor, something that hadn't been there before. A trail of what looked like dirt? No, it was more like ash, thin and gray, stretching from the hatch to the main counter. My breath caught in my throat. The unsettling feeling that had been gnawing at me returned in full force. I had to keep going. I had to see it through. With a trembling hand, I reached for the flashlight on the counter. I turned it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the hatch and the trail of ash. As I moved the light across the floor, I noticed something even more disturbing. The trail wasn't just ash, it was moving. Slowly, imperceptibly, but it was shifting, as though it were alive. My pulse quickened. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I stood frozen for a moment, the flashlight shaking in my hand, my mind racing for an explanation that would make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no explanation. There was only the truth, and the truth was that something had happened, something I didn't fully understand. I turned toward the front door, my eyes scanning the parking lot outside. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement, but everything appeared empty, silent. The usual nighttime bustle of the occasional car driving by, of people coming in to refuel, was absent. The world outside the station felt like a distant memory, like something I had once known but had been cut off from. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I instinctively turned back toward the open hatch. My breath caught in my throat. The figure. It was there. It was standing in the corner, just beyond the shadows, watching me with those empty, soulless eyes. It hadn't moved, but somehow it seemed closer, more real than before. Its form was slightly more defined now, its pale, twisted face partially visible in the dim light. The jagged features that had once been a blur were now unmistakable, and the sight of it sent a jolt of terror through my body. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to flee. I had to get out of here. I had to escape before whatever that thing was reached me. But my legs were unresponsive, like they had turned to lead. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I tried to gather the strength to move. The figure didn't advance, but it didn't need to. It was already inside my mind. The voice, that raspy whisper from before, returned. But this time, it wasn't a mere phrase. It was a question. Do you remember? The words were like ice, sliding into my brain, chilling my thoughts. I felt a pang of recognition, a memory at the edge of my consciousness that I couldn't fully grasp. Something was missing, something important. The feeling was overwhelming, like I had forgotten something vital, something that tied me to the station, to the figure, to the very place I was standing. I clenched my fists, trying to shake off the sensation, trying to focus. My mind raced, but the more I tried to fight it, the more the weight of the figure's gaze pressed against me. I wanted to look away, to run, to escape it, but something inside me kept me rooted to the spot. And then, without warning, it spoke again. You are not free. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. They echoed in my mind, reverberating off the walls, bouncing around inside my skull. My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure's form shifted, twisting like smoke in the light. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I was alone. For a moment, I stood there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. The station was silent again, but now it felt different. The air felt heavier, thicker. I had the distinct feeling that something had changed. Something that I couldn't fully understand, something that lingered just out of reach. The hatch closed by itself, its heavy metal door slamming shut with an unsettling finality. I didn't need to look inside. I knew what was there. The truth had been revealed, and yet I was no closer to understanding it than I had been when I first arrived. I turned to leave, my feet still heavy with dread, my mind racing with unanswered questions. But as I reached for the door, I froze. The streetlights outside flickered. The air, which had been stagnant, began to move, a faint breeze stirring the dust in the parking lot. And I heard it. A car! The headlights appeared out of nowhere, cutting through the dark, heading toward the station. They were bright, blinding, but the car itself never materialized. The headlights moved closer, faster, but no car followed them. The light grew, swallowing the parking lot in its glow, but there was nothing there. Just the headlights, racing toward me, closing in as though they were chasing something or someone. My heart stopped. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. I was trapped once again in the grip of something I couldn't explain. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the headlights vanished. I was left in the dark, the station silent once more, with nothing but the echo of my own breathing to remind me that I was still here. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions, yet the silence seemed almost comforting after the chaos that had unfolded. I stood there in the darkness, not knowing what to think, not knowing what to do. The world outside the gas station felt like a distant memory, like I had been pulled out of reality itself and dropped into some twisted version of it where nothing made sense. I had hoped that somehow, once the headlights vanished, the strange presence would dissipate, leaving me with nothing but the remnants of a terrifying dream. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. This wasn't something I could wake up from. Whatever was at play here was real, and it was far from over. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, but eventually I took a hesitant step toward the door. The sense of urgency returned, though it was tempered by a strange numbness that had settled over me. Every inch of my body screamed for me to leave, to run far away from this place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far I went, this would follow me. This, whatever it was, wouldn't let me go. The moment I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. It was sharp, biting, as if the world itself was trying to remind me that I was still tethered to it, still part of it. But everything around me felt wrong. The lights in the parking lot flickered again, casting strange, jagged shadows across the asphalt. I looked around, half expecting to see the same headlights that had appeared out of nowhere, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. For a brief moment, I thought I could hear the faint sound of tires on pavement, but when I turned, there was nothing. No car, no movement, no sign of anything that had happened just moments ago. I couldn't understand it. How could a car move like that? How could headlights shine so brightly without any vehicle to cast them? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The whole night felt like a series of disconnected fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. I walked away from the gas station slowly, each step heavy with uncertainty. My thoughts were racing, and yet there was no clarity, no explanation. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, the way it had watched me, the way it had spoken to me. You are not free. What did that even mean? Was I trapped here in this place? Or was it something more? Something that reached beyond the physical world? The quiet of the night felt oppressive, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was then that I realized that the terror, the fear that had clutched at my chest since I first stepped into the station, hadn't gone away. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, a constant reminder that whatever had happened wasn't over. I had to keep moving. I had to keep walking, keep putting distance between myself and that gas station. But even as I took each step, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was never going to be enough. That place, that station, would always be with me. It would follow me, no matter how far I went. The figure, the lights, the whispers, they weren't just tied to that place. They were tied to me. I didn't know if I would ever be able to escape the aftermath of what had happened. The sense of unease that had settled deep in my bones, the feeling that something was watching me, following me, never leaving me. It would be there, in the back of my mind, a constant companion, reminding me of the horrors I had witnessed. And as I walked, I began to think about the others. The other attendants who had worked there before me, the ones who had vanished or left, never to be heard from again. Was it the same thing that had happened to them? Had they experienced the same things, felt the same creeping dread, before disappearing into the night? I couldn't stop myself from looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But the road behind me was empty, just like the gas station. The world was still and quiet, as though nothing had happened at all. But that wasn't true. I knew that now. The darkness had touched me, marked me, in a way I couldn't fully understand. And though I tried to convince myself that leaving that place would bring me peace, I knew deep down that I would never be free of it. It would always be with me, haunting the edges of my thoughts, lurking in the corners of my vision. I eventually reached my car, parked on the side of the road. I didn't remember walking this far. The distance between the gas station and here felt like miles, though I knew it couldn't have been. It felt like time itself had stretched and bent, leaving me in this strange, liminal state where nothing seemed real. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the low rumble of the car's engine offering me a sense of normalcy, a connection to something familiar. But even as I began to drive away, the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gas station's lights fading in the distance, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. A road that stretched out before me, leading to a future that felt uncertain. I don't know how long I drove or how far I went, but eventually the feeling of dread began to lessen. The weight that had pressed down on me, The suffocating fear that had clouded my mind started to fade. It didn't go away completely, but it became more distant, like something I had outrun. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to believe that I had escaped it. But then I glanced at the rearview mirror again. There, in the reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The headlights. They were there again. The same headlights I had seen earlier, racing toward me. Only this time, they weren't just in the mirror. They were real. Coming closer. Growing brighter. Faster.